Hello, everybody. Hello. How's everybody doing? And we are live. So this is a good stream. This is a very, you know, important stream, and I think it's going to be extremely knowledgeable stream. And what it is about is it's about one um, interview that was taken on Alex as in Cosmic Skeptics channel. I forgot what his channel's name is called, but it was of that of Bill Craig, and it was an interview. And in this interview, Alex especially grilled William Lane Craig on the genocide, or what you call as the massacre of Canaanites. So what we're going to do is we're going to review that video and see if Bill's or William Lane Craig's arguments hold any water, and see where it fits in basically from internal consistencies perspective. So before we do that, welcome my co-host Mahaden and Khalid. How are you two doing?
I'm very good. I'm very good today. So, how are you, Kylie?
All well at my end as well. How are you doing, Philo?
Pretty good. Okay, so, let me take that back. I think probably everybody can hear that my voice is a little bit down, so I'm a little bit under the weather. So I'm probably what I'm gonna do is most of the time I'm gonna remain under the radar, and as always, let Madan and Kelly do bulk of the heavy pulling of the train basically. So, without any further ado, I think we should start. And unless Kelly, you have anything to say before that, Kelly or Martin.
No, I
No,
think nothing. No, nothing
All right.
that I have to say before the video. Let's get into it.
Yeah, I'll just add something very simple that at the bottom bar, basically, the banner, you'll see some important information, and if you guys like our content, please think of supporting us in whichever way you can. That'll be awesome. And without any further ado, I think we should start basically.
Now, I didn't invite you on the show to spend an hour agreeing with you, so I think now is a good time to move on to the actual criticisms that Dawkins has made, specifically in regards to why he refuses to debate you. As I've said before, a lot of people want to see this debate, and I know that you've offered him the opportunity a number of times, and he's turned it down. And he claims that the reason that he does this, whether this be the real reason or not, the reason he gives is that William Lane Craig is an immoral person.
Guys, is 1.25x okay? Shall I speed it up more or bring it to normal?
No, I think it sounds
this
okay.
is this is fine. I think. Yeah.
This is fine? All right. All right.
Because he is an apologist for genocide, pointing specifically in his original article and original objection to the issue of the slaughter of the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible, which you've defended as a morally defensible thing for God to have commanded and for the Israelites to have enacted. So what I really want to do now is jump into this story. I want to talk about the slaughter of the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible, what happened, why it's problematic, and what your moral defense is of that story. So perhaps we can begin by talking about who were the Canaanites?
All right. Prior to Israel's
Shall we go through this Canaanite story or maybe just move
I don't
forward
think
to
so. I don't think so. If you can give us a one or two liner summary of what actually happened, so I
uh
think that might be
yeah,
a
yeah,
bit
I mean yeah, I think
that might
God
give
of
the
the
audience
Old Testament.
a little background about what they're talking about.
Yeah, I think a very brief summary that I can give is basically, according to the Old Testament, basically the first five books of Old Testament, God called the then promised land was inhabited by ethnic group called Canaanites, basically, and uh, they were immoral, basically debauched. They were doing all sorts of debauchery, and then God commanded, I think Joshua, I'm not quite sure which one of the prophets, but commanded him and his Israelite forces to invade the Canaanite and kill all the Canaanites, basically. And so there are different versions that probably Bill is gonna, present. Basically, he says the command was not to kill all of them, but to drive them out of that land, out of the promised land, and that's about it. So that's why it's called the massacre of mass killing of or destruction of Canaanites, basically. So that's in a
Yes.
nutshell that I can explain, basically, and that's
Now
why it's
I
basically. Yeah.
Now, I might be wrong over here because I'm not sure if that is the only story where Israelites are ordered to or to attack and take over a land. But this is also hinted in Quran as well. Just wanted to point that out. I think this recalls of a story when Moses actually told the Israelites when he had he brought them out of Egypt, saving them from Pharaoh. Moses was actually Moses ordered, based on an order from God, to attack probably Jerusalem. And the Israelites actually said that no, we are not ready, and they actually sort of were afraid that no, they will not be able to overcome them. So yeah, and then they were ordered, okay, and then they had to wait for 40 years. So I guess
Right, right,
that is a story that might be linked to that, because ultimately they did attack, but that is not pointed out. That is not there is not too much detail in Quran. But yeah, I think
right,
this
right, right.
reminds
So
me of that.
this is the Old Testament story. I
Yeah.
think I'm not what books it is in. I'll probably have to. It's in Deuteronomy 7.1 to 2, uh, 20.16 to 20.18, basically. So this story is there. These are the references that I have already given you. Anybody who wants probably can search them and see. I might be wrong about who the prophet who was commanded. Probably Moses. Probably Joshua. I might be wrong about that. So
No, actually,
don't take my word for that.
I think this, because this happened after the attack actually happened after Moses died, even according to Islamic stories. But he was
Okay.
ordered,
Okay.
but they did not actually attack, because the Israelites did not actually defied. They said that no, they are very strong, and we'll not be able to overcome them. So that's why. So yeah, I guess we can just get into the video now.
Yeah. Yeah.
I suppose I intuitively find it difficult to believe that there's not a single person in this community who is not so like unsalvageably touched or consumed by sin in this way that the action.
Just wanted to add one point here. The main contention that Alex is gonna bring in here is that all right, the adults were doing all those, whatever God were doing opposed to what God commanded them to, right? Or what was moral. Basically, they were debauch and all those things. They were getting into, all kind of immoral practices. But when the Israelite army attacked, uh, almost all the adults were killed, children were killed, and livestock were killed as well, right? So the main problem, the main contention in this interview that Alex is going to raise is pretty much going to hinge around those innocents, basically, adults as well as kids, basically, right? So I just wanted to point that out.
We see the Israelites committing on the command of God can be justified. So to give people an idea, to give them the full picture, we've described who the Canaanites are, and I'm sure you'll have something to say about that. But the reason that this is a problem, the reason why Richard Dawkins is talking about these people, is because, as you say, God promises this land to the Israelites, and he waits 400 years and says this is because the sin sort of hasn't got bad enough yet. Essentially, he says it will happen in 400 years because by that point things will be so bad that this will be this will be sort of justifiably inflicted. But he commands the Israelites to destroy the Canaanites. And the language used in the Bible is quite extreme in a few different areas, talking about completely destroying a city, leaving nothing alive that breathes. And on the point about innocent people, because I know you'll have something to say about that, but we know that there are at least some innocent people among the Canaanites, because in the 6th chapter of Joshua, in the destruction of Jericho, it said that they devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Now, maybe the men and women were immoral. I certainly don't think that children living among the Canaanites were immoral enough to justify their being killed, and certainly not the cattle, the sheep, and the donkeys.
Right. The difficult, I think, aspect of this is the children. The adults were corrupt. if there was an innocent person among the adults,
Sorry,
that
can you pause
person
it?
didn't have to be killed. It's important to understand that.
I don't want to go into too much detail, but I just want to say that he says that the difficult part is the children. I think the difficult part includes animals as well. They're equally that part is equally difficult to explain.
Right. I think somewhere on the line, down the line, probably, I think,
Yes,
uh, Alex is going to mention that as well,
mention
probably.
that.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
just wanted to point that out. But yes,
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah. And the other
God's
thing is,
command is
yeah, and the other thing is, just to let other people know, William Lane Craig does admit that the problem of evil, which is this sort of conversation generates, basically, or the problem of suffering, is probably the hardest, at least emotionally, problem to grapple, right? So he actually genuinely finds this difficult to explain away, and he does put a lot of effort into explain it away. But he says that it's emotionally troubling. Ultimately, then says that although it's emotionally troubling, it's not
yes,
intellectually troubling.
it's not intellectually. Yes,
Yeah,
he says
and
that.
yeah, but I submit that when he figures out that it's emotionally troubling, he's closer to being right than his intellectual rationalizations, right? As to why his emotional rationality. I don't think that's a word really, emotional rationality, but what he means by emotional is that his instincts as to what is right and wrong, and I think reality is whatever his instincts are as to what is right and wrong. That a more sophisticated version of that is going to be going to be what defeats his so-called intellectual defense. In other words, he's right when he was emotionally thinking this is troubling, right? And we'll build on that. We'll build on that as that goes on. But I just wanted to bring the viewer's attention that he actually himself thinks this is quite difficult. Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Israel was not genocide, despite a superficial first reading of these narratives. More fundamentally, it was a command to drive the Canaanites out of the land on pain of death. No one had to be killed if these tribes would simply retreat and flee in the face of the advancing Israeli army. It was only those who tried to stay behind and resist who were to be completely exterminated. So people didn't have to die. They weren't pursued and chased down until everyone was exterminated. These clans were driven out of the land. They were be destroyed as nation states, but not as individual people. And it's important to understand that for these ancient Near Eastern people, as for modern Near Eastern people, it is the land that is so important. It is all about the land. Even today, when you go to Israel, people will talk about coming to the land. That's how they refer to it. So what God was doing was
I just wanted to raise one objection, and I don't know if you guys agree with me over here. And that objection is you're thinking about an omnipotent God who can do almost everything in his power, right? And now think about this whole situation, right? It might not seem as a logical objection, but think about that Canaanites being in this debauchery for 400 years, God allowing them for 400 years to be debauched, basically, or whatever the term you want to use over there, and then the best solution that that divine being can come up with is commanding an army of Israelites to invade and kill them. I mean, think about it. I mean, this is probably an emotional argument, but it's probably not just an emotional argument. You can think if you can come up with a better solution than this, then probably that being who has an infinite wisdom can come up with probably an infinite number of better solutions than this, basically, right?
Yeah. I think that probably is going to be the overarching sort of methodology that we're going to be using is the idea that when we think about trying to explain this problem of evil, it's a species of problem of evil. It's one incident or one set of incidents, like the genocide, let's say. Here, that's being committed here. that we should think about it in not in the sense of what a limited person or finite person is doing, but on a person in the sense that what an unlimited, infinitely powerful person that supposedly has characteristics of goodness, which goodness, this term goodness is attached to other attributes such as love, compassion,
Yes,
fairness, mercy, whatever
all
you want to
good,
call it.
right,
Yeah.
right, right.
And so it's when you say good, it might sound vague, but the goodness literally means here all of these are the axioms, these are the virtues that are built into the definition of God that William Lane Craig concedes. And most Christians would also agree that their God is a God of goodness, which is again translated to fairness, translated to just and justness, which is and then compassion, and you generally get a common sense understanding of morals here, a common sense understanding of what ethics is predicated and built into the definition of God. But in addition to that, God is this super powerful being with infinite power, and he can do almost anything that's logically possible. So when you keep that in mind, now, yeah, and I don't think what what you said here is emotional or not a logical argument. In fact, it is. It's coming from an emotional place, but that does not mean you can't make a logical argument, which it is, because when you start off with these characteristics, then you need to ask. It's a simple case of, does it fit the world? You have an infinitely powerful ethical being, love, compassion, all this, unless the Christian disputes this, but most Christians won't, and I don't think Bill Craig does either. Then
Right, right.
is that reconcilable with that the God had to, in order to do the most compassionate thing in the just way, in the fairest way, he had to allow for this XYZ set of atrocities? Well, the simple answer is that if you're an infinite powerful being, you could have avoided that and designed the world in a different way so that these things don't have to happen, right? And it's logically possible to have a world where these things don't have to happen. In fact, the the original reasons, the original motivation as to why God has to intervene did not have to happen in the first place for him to intervene. In other words, he created a mess that he had to correct with another
He
mess.
wanted to make a better world, basically.
Yes, and he
You
could have
see the
resisted.
point. The
Yeah,
intention was to make a better world by eliminating Canaanites, right?
yes,
So he could have done that without going through this whole shebang, basically, in a
Actually,
yeah,
sense.
yeah.
Yes.
Go on, Philip. Go on, Kylie.
yes. I mean, yeah, I mean, just what you said at the end. I want to correct you over there. That you said that just solution was to end Canaanites. Actually, that was not the solution. That was not the solution according to William Lane Craig. The solution was to just drive the Canaanites out of the land, the pure land. Although God allowed them to stay there and commit all those sins and debaucheries for maybe hundreds of years. I think that's what the story goes on, tells
Four,
us.
400, 500 years,
400,
something like
500
that.
years.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but now God wants them to not commit those sins in Jerusalem or in that promised land,
In that
because He said
land, right?
that the key is, it's not, the focus is not actually ending the Canaanites, it's about driving them out. And
Of the Holy
they
Land.
will not be followed. Exactly, they just have to go out of the Holy Land, and then they can continue committing the same sins and all the debaucheries that they were doing in that holy land. They're just not allowed to do all of that in the holy land. And I think that's something important that we should deal with. That was the solution that God came up with, according to William Lane Craig. The problem was purifying the holy land. It was not about removing evil or sin from the earth, from the world. There was no overall reduction in sin that God wanted. God wanted to just to remove them, those people, out of that land and commit those sins at a different place. And that is what actually is the implication of what William Lane Craig is saying.
Right, right, right. So basically, what you're saying, in short, God wanted his shrine to be cleaned up, basically.
Exactly.
Okay, okay,
For
okay.
some reason, this land is holy. What makes it
Right.
holy? I'm not sure there have been people living here for the past 400 years committing. I'm not no,
Yeah,
God knows what kind
that's
of
what the
sins,
original.
and the land still stays holy. The animals are impure, become impure because they are, for some reason, they are also asked to be driven out. Although the animals could have been kept with them, but even the animals were asked to be killed or ordered to be killed. The the children were asked to be killed, maybe, and for whatever reason, but the land stayed pure for some reason. That's, I find that of a bit funny, maybe, that maybe the water that they were using, did God ask them to actually burn every tree that was that was over there? Did God ask them to actually maybe throw away all the water that was there because people were drinking out of that water, people were actually using that water to bathe? Everything was made impure by those Canaanites, but except the land, for some reason, for some very strange reason.
All right, yeah, that's something. Yeah, that's something to be
There's just something to think
to
about. It's
think
yeah, it's
about.
not
Right, right.
yeah, it's just something to think about.
It's a slightly bit more awkwardish situation than probably
Yeah,
just finishing the immoral souls basically. Okay, get away from it.
Yeah.
Do all
And
that you want to do, but don't do it in my house, basically.
yeah. Don't do it over here.
Yeah,
Do it somewhere else, where which is not my land. God's
yeah.
land is everywhere. What makes
Right.
that
I
land
mean,
holy? I'm not sure.
yeah, yeah.
That's a question. So that's people should think about.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate that if there are alternative, again, so this I just want to cement this kind of method that we're going to be emphasizing. If there are alternative ways of achieving a more moral end that aligns or is inconsistent with those axioms that we've talked about, like compassion and justice and fairness and stuff, and these
Right,
things can be just very commonsensical moral ideas, right? Like compassion is just um, taking the interests of others and trying to be considerate of them and trying to emphasize them and so on. Now, clearly, my compassion would differ based on my resources, my limited knowledge, the amount of options I have to help people. Right? If there's like two people, homeless people outside, and I've got a little bit of food, I can distribute the food in a way that can help the most people, and so on. That seems to be a very easy kind of understanding of compassion. That's what we do when we say we're compassionate. We try to take the interests of others as though they are of our own, almost like they are of our own, and we will help people, but we're limited by those resources. But if you have infinite resources, then the answer is very simple, right? If the yeah, in order to be the most compassionate, you're just going to
exactly.
help
Yeah,
everybody, and everybody's interest will be satisfied in every logically possible way without contradictions, right? Now, if somebody's interest
right.
is to rape another person, then that can't be satisfied. But every sort of logical way of satisfying each and everyone's interest. And in this case, if God wanted to achieve that goal, is there other logical possible ways he could have achieved it? And yes, he didn't have to cause this collateral damage where he excessively kills and attacks or allows it to happen, where little children face X, Y, Z, and animals face X, Y, Z. Um, he could have just moved them away from the equation, right, and just delivered what he wanted to deliver without causing that collateral damage. Simple as that.
Yeah,
And
I mean, yeah, exactly, Madan. Just the same thought that occurred to me, that if the goal was to, as Callie said, just drive them away, and as even we heard Craig mentioning, right, and Callie rightly pointed to us, if the motive was just to move them away from that land, there would have been still many thousand ways of doing that without causing a you know, single bodily harm, pretty much, right? Not that it could have been difficult. It might have taken maybe probably, instead of just days, 2 days, 3 days, maybe a month probably, or more than a month. But that
yeah,
could have been there could have been much more peaceful and much more moral and much more compassionate way of doing that. In essence, you could have still said that God is all good, basically, and that He would have done exactly that way, basically, driven them out, but driven them out with His goodness,
yeah.
pretty much.
And the other thing is, why let the events unfold in such a way where you have to then act act in forms of intervention later on? So it's a bit like a parent who creates a child who he knows on his 5th birthday he's going to go murder everybody, and therefore the parent then kills his own child on the. But a compassionate parent wouldn't, right from the very beginning, create the child in the first place like that when he knows he's on his 5th birthday he's going to murder everybody, right? So the parent can say, for example, I had to intervene out of self-defense, right, to ensure that my child doesn't murder everybody, and therefore I had to go and obliterate my child. Yeah,
Right,
you
right.
can say that,
No,
but
even you can take this even a step further back. Maybe
yeah.
before the conception, even when the sperm and eggs are meeting, if you could somehow find out through DNA study or something that you would have probably a disturbed child who's gonna be
That's
a
exactly what I
serial
mean. Yeah,
killer
that's
or
what
something. Yeah.
I mean. If the parent could have
Oh,
controlled, yeah, exactly what I mean. If the
okay.
parent,
So that's what you meant. Sorry.
yeah,
I
that's
thought
exactly
you
what I
said
mean.
once he was born. Basically, I thought.
Yes,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah.
Right.
What I mean,
Yeah.
is if a I forgot exactly what I was trying to say, but I think it was the idea that if a parent had known that that's going to happen, right? I think that's what I said. Now that could be due to DNA, genetics, some sort of technology, AI. I don't know, but it's a hypothetical. But if a parent knew that the child on his 5th birthday is going to do X, Y, Z, and then does that, and in order to stop the child from doing that, kills the child, and we say, why did you kill your child? And he comes out with all these great justifications, even if they make sense, even if they're defensible. If the parent had the ability, the power, and the foreseeability, remember the power, foreseeability. If he had a head start, the parent, to foresee and had the power to stop these events from occurring, and not only stop, but or not create, which is power to not create a chain of events that would lead to the 5th birthday, which would result in this sort of massacre that the child would do. Then the defense dissolves away. The question is, then why did you create that particular child? If you had the power to stop it, and if you had the power to create an alternative child, a different one, where that story, that narrative, that chain of events would have never have unfolded in the first place. So Bill Craig is being a bit too late here by being very microscopic in taking into account the details of these very local events in this tiny slice of time, whilst missing the big picture, which is that God did not have to create a chain of events where in the end he had to intervene to fix his problem. So sneakily, what we can enter, not sneakily to be honest, conspicuously, what we can enter here is Justin Schellenberg's argument of the problem of evil, which is that God did not have to go from a state of perfection to a state to create a world which was imperfect when he could have created or not created a world in the first place, because he was already perfect, right? And if he was going to create a world, he could have created heaven straight away. He did not, and in between heaven and this finite world, there's an infinite number of different types of worlds that he could have created, where the Canaanites and this situation, this historical time period and the events within it did not have to unfold in this way, in which he had to come and intervene. And so Bill Craig is not looking at the total picture here, basically, where God would not do this, or basically a being that has compassion and all this stuff. Again, remember, power, foreseeability, compassion means that you have alternative choices and you could have created better universes where this didn't have to happen. Simple as that. Yeah.
Yeah, Mahadev. Yes, that's good. Kelly, you want to add something to it?
No, I think
was
Madan has said a
giving the
lot.
land of
Continue.
Or sorry, yeah, I moved away from it.
Canaan from or to Israel, and divesting these Canaanite clans of the possession of the land of Canaan. And so they were driven out, and not all of them were killed. Later in the narratives in the Pentateuch, you find Canaanites still about.
Yeah.
So they weren't all killed.
If I may, on this point that we've got to so far, firstly, this idea that, well, not everybody's killed because they're given the opportunity to leave their land. They're given the opportunity to be driven out. It's only if they stay and resist that they get killed. And the way you just cash that out is by saying, so they had a decision and didn't have to die. It seems to me that of course, you're going to understand this as something that God has commanded. So whatever the reason may be, it must be the morally right thing to do. However, from my perspective, what I'm seeing here is a foreign nation approaching the native inhabitants of land which they believe is their own, saying, you need to leave. And when they refuse, killing them, and then saying, well, look, I gave you a choice, didn't I? Because you could have just left. I mean, that in other words, doesn't seem like much of a defense to me.
Right. We were talking about whether or not the Canaanites were corrupt and whether or not this was an act of divine judgment upon them. But I've not explicated here the moral theory that undergirds my defense of this action. It is very possible that had this been undertaken by human initiative alone, that it would have been immoral, as the way you described. But the ethical theory that I defend is called divine command morality. And this has two components to it. First is that the good is based in God himself. God is the paradigm of moral goodness. He is by nature loving, fair, just, and so forth. Second element is that God's nature then expresses itself toward us in the form of divine commands that constitute our moral duties. According to this theory, moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by a qualified authority. So, for example, if I were driving and some random person told me to pull over, I wouldn't have any obligation to obey that person at all. But if a policeman commanded me to pull over, then in virtue of his authority, I would have a legal obligation to pull over and obey what he's done. And so the theory is that moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by the paradigm of goodness himself, who is God. Now, presumably, God doesn't issue commands to himself as to what he should do. And
Can you pause
therefore,
here?
on this theory, God has no moral.
So William Lane Craig just said that God has some sort of authority, and that is why that. And I think he's trying to explain where does the ought come from in the moral, in the divine command theory, because God has the authority of prescribing these rules to us. I think a question that we should ask over here is, even if God is the creator of this world, and whatever attribute you assign to that God, I think I would still ask, and I would still need a justification as to why should I consider that being as an authority or something that he asks me to do. I should do that, and or I ought to do that. The is ought problem, I think, still stays to be a big problem in this case, as to why should what God prescribes becomes a
why should you do
responsibility.
what God?
Yeah,
Yeah.
becomes an obligation on me to do. Why is that the case? What makes something that God says an obligation on me? I think that that's a question that he should answer, or I mean, the theist should answer.
Mahadin, you want to add something to it?
Yeah, I mean, William Lane Craig, in respect to that, simply says that God is the ontological basis for
For all good,
good,
basically.
right? In other
Yeah.
words, his answer to that is just a necessary truth, maybe, or something like that. That it simply just follows by the fact that God has certain attributes embedded within him. That so, if you ask the question like, why should I follow God's commands? The answer to that is that it simply is the case that a command is to be followed. But then if you
Right,
ask,
right.
well, why is there, what oughtness do I have to follow the command? Because the command in itself is the oughtness. So that's kind of what it is. It's like it kind of the buck stops at that, right?
You're right, right.
Stops at
Yeah.
that. But it's not necessarily clear why. So one of the reasons might be because he says that God, in his definition, is the answer to the is-ought problem. That's kind of like a trivial way of solving the is-ought dichotomy. I mean, the whole point of the is-ought problem, or
I
we
mean,
can't
if that
derive an
is,
ought. Yeah, the whole point of trying to derive an ought from an is that there's a difficulty of trying to derive normative statements from descriptive statements without a desire, let's say, or something like that. Right? It's one way the world is a particular way. The world is a particular way. and it's hard to derive an ought from it. And David Hume exemplifies why. He lays down the mechanics, saying that here's a child being hurt, and the child is feeling pain, but the idea that this is bad, or this is, that you should stop it, is nowhere to be found in the objective reality. So as you're observing the child being hurt, what can you see happening? Well, what you can see happening is the child is crying, blood is coming out, or whatever. There's a knife, whatever. But where is goodness here? Where is evil? Where is horror? Where are these things? Well, these are part of your emotions. They're not in the objective world, they're in the subjective world inside of your mind, and is therefore part of your desire. So David Hume shows that the fact that you feel like you ought to stop, or you might command somebody that you ought to stop the horrendous torture of this child, is not part of the objective world. It's not, the ought does not exist outside. It's in your mind, and therefore it's subjective. Right? What is happening, therefore?
Right.
It is happening that the baby is being tortured, but you can't get an ought from that. That's pretty much it. But the reason we believe this is really persuasive is because he's laid down a mechanics showing that it's hard to derive an ought from an is. How does William Lane Craig suggest that we solve this? He doesn't. He just defines.
I don't think he does. I don't think
Yeah.
he does.
He just says God by definition solves it. But that's a trivial statement. It doesn't explain through. It's like saying
We could say that for anything. We
Yes,
could
it's
make
like-
that moral standard of our own, and then say that, okay, by definition, everyone should follow this moral standard.
Yeah.
Right. I think the problem is that he can, and one of the problems that I find in his analogy that he gave, right, of a cop commanding versus any stranger. You can
Yeah.
have a stranger deny that, but when a cop is stopping you, basically what a cop has a certain kind of character and certain rules that he himself has
Exactly.
to follow, right? The same should
You
be
ought
applied
not.
to the God as well. Once you say
Exactly.
that God starts to ask you to do something that you think does not suit on him, and in this case that he's all good, and he commands something to do something for you to do that you think does not fit to him, you would not obey that, right? So that's kind of doesn't fit in here what Craig is saying. I think this analogy doesn't really fit basically over there.
Yeah.
Well, Craig, one
Yeah.
minute before you continue with that. What Craig is saying is that there are two components to this. Yeah, it's not merely the fact that God commands something. It's the fact that the God commands something in line with his goodness, in line with compassion, fairness, justness. Right? So William Lane Craig would concede, Philo, if you just said a mere command is what makes something good. He's not saying that. So the police example, he would agree with that if the policeman said something contrary to those characteristics, well, in his world, it has to be in line with God's morality. If the policeman breached something that is not in line with God's morality, then the policeman's commands are not worthy of being followed. Whereas if the policeman is saying something that's moral, then it is. So it's completely consistent.
Sorry, can you repeat last sentence? If the policeman is saying?
If the policeman is saying something that is inconsistent with divine morality, let's say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or morality, whatever the objective morality is, under William Lane Craig's world, the policeman cannot say something that is contrary to God's morality,
Exactly.
right?
By
So
definition.
Yes. So he has to say things
He
that
cannot.
are, yeah. So he would agree with you. William Lane Craig will agree with you that the mere fact that the policeman is commanding something doesn't make something moral. It's the fact that it is consistent with God's divine goodness, right? And the fact that he's commanding something. And it's the same thing for God. The mere fact that God is commanding something is not what making it moral. There's two components. Maybe there's more components, but the two main components in relevance here, which is that he is commanding something and his command imperatives ought to be followed, but also because God is goodness, and goodness boils down to fairness, love, compassion. right? If God didn't have those characteristics, or God was different, maybe then the command imperative ought not be followed. So it's a combination of these things that is saying the
Right.
command.
I agree. I agree with those 2 points. I'm saying, but what if
Mhm.
your understanding of those things doesn't fit in with your understanding of goodness of him, basically? What if that happens?
Now, in case of God, William Lane Craig would say that because that uh, if I'm using that policeman analogy, he would say that in that case, if you think that the what policeman is asking you to do is not actually the right thing, or that is not in line with law, William Lane Craig would say, well, actually, in that case, you will. What would be the case is that you are not aware of the law. It would be your ignorance of the law. The policeman, by
So
definition,
you're
in
ignorant,
his case,
basically, right? Okay.
yeah. So he would appeal to what you'd call a moral. What's that? I don't know the word,
Skeptical
but
theism.
yeah, exactly. So his skeptical theism, so he would argue that the policeman knows the law actually, and he can never by definition ask you to do something against the law, or that goes against the law. And therefore, if you think that what he's asking you to do is against the law, then it's actually your ignorance of the law, not the policeman's law command that is not in line with the law. I'm
Right,
saying that
right,
that is how he would apply that analogy.
right, right, right.
Okay, and that's what he would say.
Yeah.
Agree, agree.
But that creates a whole cluster of problems. So if you do go down that
Exactly.
route and say that, first of all, God is goodness and God's goodness is fairness, but then there's some sort of contradiction between so God says he's fair, but then he's doing something that is obviously not fair, and then you may say, well, my understanding of fairness is that it should be this way, but God is doing something completely different. So he may then say, well, God has a better understanding of fairness than you. That creates so if you go down the mystery route, and I've said this before, and I've echoed it, it's become like a cliche now. If you go down the mystery route, you do end up in complete moral blackout, right?
Moral
So
chaos, basically.
yeah, well, kind of, yeah, like chaos. So there's a language gap now. Remember, we talked about the language gap, the alien issue. So it means that
Right, right. Definitely.
concept
Yeah,
of,
that's the problem
God's
now.
concept of
Yeah.
fairness is so above ours that we can never attest to whether
I
or not.
think I use the chaos, moral chaos, a little bit too weakly. I think moral language chaos should be proper.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah. And I remember, I think one of our fellow friends, Ukba, also wrote a comment maybe on the last couple of videos. He also raised this point as well. Whereas if we are if we are in total moral blackout or ignorance now, because we are ignorant, then God can just, one, make up his own morality. Two, we can never. How do we say God is fair if we can't measure fairness? So that's the language problem, right? So it's like an alien speaking in gibberish, right? And the alien says, I'm speaking at a very high proficient standard of gibberish. But no human knows how to speak this gibberish language. So how do we know that the alien is speaking to a high standard or low standard? Yeah, because we don't have the criterion to measure the alien's proficiency. We just take him at his word, right? And that's the issue here. So this is not an ontological problem. Ontologically, it's very possible that there is a being that is fair, and because of our limited imaginations, that fairness, we just can't test it,
right.
etc.
This is an epistemic problem, basically
Yeah,
now.
this is an epistemic
Yeah.
problem. Just like there might be like ghosts that we can't see ontologically, but the epistemic problem is that we can never verify or deny it because we don't know how to. If we can't see it, if it's beyond our senses, then we're in total ignorance, and it's an epistemic problem. So William Lane Craig creates an epistemic problem where we can never therefore say God is actually moral, and therefore the problem, I would submit, the problem of evil will stand here. Reason being, the two ways to the problem of evil is effective here: one, proving that the God is evil, or two, not being able to confirm God is good. Right? I think those two ways are satisfactory. So either proving God is evil,
Yeah.
yeah, or if they go down the mystery route, then we can be nonetheless wiser. then we're like ignorant. But then if we're ignorant, then we can never confirm that God was good or that this wasn't evil. William Lane Craig simply saying God just knows, but how do we know God just knows? Well, it's still theoretically possible that it's evil, and therefore theists can't say God is good, and it still debunks therefore theism, because for theism, at least to be philosophically defensible, they need to be able to at least make a good case for God, that God is good.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
Okay, shall we move on? We'll keep adding more points once we listen to it, even if we have
Yeah.
to, go back and add some points.
Moral obligations to fulfill. And therefore, as you rightly said, it's impossible that God could do something wrong, because right and wrong are defined by divine commands, and God doesn't issue commands to himself to obey. So what constraint is there then on the moral commands of God? Well, it will be his own perfectly good nature, his own just and loving nature, that will determine whether or not a command is available to him. Now, what this means is that there are lots of actions then that God can perform that would be prohibited morally to us. For example, you wouldn't have the moral right to kill me. But if God wants to strike me dead right now, that's his prerogative. God takes and gives life as he wills. So if God wills to end the life of the Canaanite children prematurely, that's his prerogative. So God doesn't have the same sort of moral constraints that we do, because he doesn't have moral obligations to fulfill. He has to act only in consistency with his own nature. And so when you think of it in those terms, Alex, the problem posed by the conquest narrative is as follows. It's very similar to the problem of evil, that there is a sort of internal inconsistency between two propositions affirmed by the Judeo-Christian faith. The first would be that God is all just and all loving. And the second, in this case, would be that God has issued a command to Israel to drive out the Canaanites on pain of death from the land. And so my argument is that those two propositions are completely consistent with each other, because God wrongs no one in issuing such a command. And if he wrongs no one, then there is no moral constraint on his issuing such a command.
Now, I see a few problems with this, and I think my listeners will too intuitively. There's nothing I can say to prove that that's wrong, that maybe God can just...
If you want to add any point to it. Okay, just a thought, and see if it holds any water, basically. When he says that he has done no wrong to anyone, so let me just put this idea ahead. Why he wronged everybody else? Because anybody who listened to this story and rejected Christianity altogether, probably, and is going to go to hell, God has wronged him, basically, right? Because in their minds, this story didn't seem to be coming from any good God, basically, any compassionate, and just God, basically. So not only that, as even Alex points out later on, that the soldiers who went over there to kill them, it was wrong on them as well, pretty much, right? So in my opinion, at least, I think almost a lot of people, not only at that point, but in future, right now as well, and probably in future as well, were being wronged pretty much, because if they're not everybody is as intellectually capable as William Lane Craig to read that story and say, oh no, these were the justifications, these are the philosophical arguments, and that's how God wanted it to do, basically. So any of those who rejected the Christian God, basically, on basis of that, and goes to hell, basically, was wronged. At least that's my opinion. What do you guys think?
So William Lane Craig's argument is the idea that God can't do anything wrong. So it'll just be the case that by definition, we just don't know the reasons exactly. It's not clear and accessible to us simply because he's such a superior
Right. No, I
being.
mean, he asked the question, who was wrong, basically, and that's the response to that question, basically.
So
In this story, let's just take this story in its isolatedness, basically, right? And see, I mean, he created a definitional boundary which you can't just breach, basically, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So he's trying to say that there'll be is an internal consistency between the definition of God and the events that unfolded, right? So it's not consistent for God to create these sort of events. What he's trying to say, given that God
Yeah. I mean, if you have to stay on that path, then you'll have to say that all those who are going to go to hell were God's plan. Basically, they were to, because if omniscience is to be held as one of the attributes, then he knew that exactly this is how everything is going to unfold, and those who are not going to believe in him because of this particular story, not tickling their brains, are going to reject this particular God, then they'll be in hell. So you either accept that he's malevolent as well, pretty much.
sorry, I don't know what you mean. Either accept, you have to accept that he's malevolent. What do you mean?
So what I'm saying, that he knew beforehand, if he's omniscient, so he knew, knowing this story, everybody who hears that story and cannot philosophically justify the reasons behind it and rejects the Christian God, basically, goes to hell. That's true. So far, you are with me, right? So I'm saying, if that God knew this and still allowed this to happen, and to let those souls go to hell for eternity, isn't that malevolence? I mean, it's not a sign of a just God, pretty much, just and good God, right? Or does that definition still fit to this God, basically?
So I think so. What I'm trying to say is that when William Lane Craig says there's no internal inconsistency, simply because he builds into the definition of fairness, love in these events to make it reconcilable, and if it does not seem reconcilable, the whole point is that God's fairness and love and so on is something that we cannot ascertain or assess. Again, it goes back to what we talked about, the moral ignorance problem. Right? In other words, by definition, since God is just, he will never do something that is unjust, and therefore, by definition, this is not an unjust act. Now, following from that, you can assess this.
Yeah, I think the problem is we are running into this epistemic problem, basically. Our problem, the problem of language, basically, probably. That's the barrier here, I think, right? I mean, there's no way we can judge, God on the basis of our understanding, basically. He has definitionally isolated God to a level where we can't even question him, pretty much, right?
Yeah,
That's
I
what you are pointing to.
Yeah, I think that this is called that. This catches theists who make this sort of argument in a bind. Both routes are problematic, so we don't need to be hard committed to either or. Whether we can understand and assess epistemically God's love and assess whether or not it's internally consistent or not, or whether or not we can't assess it. Both are problems. If we can assess it, then clearly this is not love. There is an internal inconsistency, and therefore the problem of evil succeeds.
Yeah, that's what I'm posing here. That let's say, assuming that we can assess, right?
Yeah.
That's,
so
that's how I'm arguing here, right?
Let me just finish this part, because what I'm trying to say is that
Sure.
both options are difficult, right? So either we can assess it, because they're caught in a bind. Either we can assess it. So let's call it the strong problem of evil and versus the weak problem of evil, right? The strong problem of evil demonstrate that there is an internal consistency. The weak problem of evil demonstrate that theists can't reconcile this evil properly, right? Both are successful objections from the point of the atheist, right? So the strong problem of evil is that, yes, we can actually assess that so there's an internal consistency. God is supposed to be loving, but there's a genocide. And God is supposed to be all-powerful, but there's a genocide. All-powerful, all-loving God can do alternative things and not a genocide. Therefore, God does not exist. That's the strong problem of evil. But then, if William Lane Craig says it's always the case that God, a loving God, would not command something that is unjust, and therefore, by definition, even a genocide is just. And you might think, oh, but our understanding of fairness, love, how do I can't make this consistent with the genocide? Well, that's problem with you, your ignorance. God's understanding of love and just, and it is not arbitrary. This is actual love, actual fairness. Had you had the brain of God, had the capacities of God, you would understand that this was actually the most loving thing, right? If we go down that route, then we're stuck with the weak problem of evil, in which the language problem arises. Then you can make the objection that, all right, since we don't have the brain of God, since we can't assess God, that means we can never determine whether God actually is moral, right? Because God's morality is far beyond us. So when God says that this is loving, since our concept of love doesn't map onto what God says is loving, well, how do we know he's actually loving? It's an epistemic problem.
It could be just gibberish, basically. Yeah.
It could just be, it could be also, it is gibberish. In fact, it is gibberish. When I say gibberish, it means it's incoherent, right? Because when I say love, I have all these, from my human understanding, I have all these ideas about love, right? Like I have to show affection, take interest of people, care for people. But when God says love, he's thinking genocide, right? or when God says love, he's saying that he has a different definition.
Let them out of this land. That's my love.
Well, what I mean is, soon as he when he appeals to Bill Craig appeals to ignorance, he's saying his definition. We cannot assess this definition of love.
Right.
But then what? So initially, we have a definition of love, but God's definition of love is opaque, empty, and has no meaning. It's blank, right? It's this black category. It's this undefined category, right? And we can't measure it. So there's an epistemic gap. So it is indeed gibberish because it's incoherent. So either love makes sense, and therefore we can measure God, and therefore the strong problem of evil succeeds, where God's attributes are inconsistent with the state of affairs of the world, or the weak problem of evil succeeds, in which God's characteristics are entirely opaque, but William Lane Craig simply says that they're consistent with the world, right? Now, William Lane Craig says that that is completely consistent because, by definition, his attributes ensure that the world is also created in a way that is consistent with his attributes. But we would be in an epistemic blind spot here, because we can never measure whether that's actually happening. Right? So when God says God is loving and he allows genocide, let's say, he's saying that we don't know what love means, but this is somehow consistent with genocide. But how do we go around?
Right. I think, yeah, totally agree with that point. Yes.
Yeah. So the weak problem of evil here is the idea that since we can't confirm that what God means by loving is truly loving, or because we don't even know what loving means, we don't know whether God is actually a moral being, because in fact it's incoherent. It makes no sense. Where literally, when William Lane Craig says God is loving, he's saying God is blah blah blah, and it's consistent with his blah blah blahness to commit a genocide. Can you see what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Agreed.
Right.
Agreed. And I mean, sorry, is there too much background noise at my end? Is that fine?
So William Lane Craig, let me just repeat that before Kali starts.
Right.
God is blah blah blah, consistent with God for committing a genocide. Genocide is consistent with blah blah blah. Because as soon as you mention love, unless and you start defining it, it can't be consistent with genocide. If loving is to mean you take the interests of others and you don't hurt other people to achieve certain aims, and you have infinite power, then by definition you can't commit a genocide. The only time you can't do that is when William Lane Craig says, no, it is consistent. We just don't know what love means here, but it's somehow consistent. But then God, he is literally saying, God is loving is the same as God is blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah is consistent with genocide. Well, what the heck is that? We don't know. And still the problem with evil is in effect, right? Because theists have conceded that we don't know what a compassionate God would look like.
Exactly.
Right. And sorry, Kelly, you wanted to say something. You haven't
No, no,
said
I mean, I
before.
just wanted to say that, and then this actually shows that one would need to ask these theists that if we have known, if we don't have a way to understand what God's goodness and fairness and justice means, then why are we using those words? The only reason that you're using those words is just to entice those positive feelings that a human associates with those words, but you're actually in when you ask when you dig deep, you're saying, well, actually it doesn't exactly mean what we usually understand by those terms. So this is actually a deception. They're actually deceiving the public by using the words, associating the words good and justice and fairness with God. But then when you are asking the question as to how is God good and just and fairness, you're like, well, it's not exactly the same as our understanding of good and fairness. Well, what if that actual god's God's nature is actually in line with what we consider or what we generally use associate with evil? We have no way of actually knowing. And so therefore this is a kind of deception that is being being carried out by these theists, I think, by using these words, if that is
Yeah,
how they understand it.
yeah, and that would
Right.
be the root problem of evil, in the sense that we can never know God is good in our commonsensical way, right?
Exactly.
Since we can never know God is good in that way, he could be, as Kylie said, using the word fairness and love in a way that is completely like our commonsensical understanding of evil, right? And that is still part of the problem of evil, right? Because if God is like that, then he's evil in our understanding. And furthermore, if we can't confirm God is good in our commonsensical way, then you've not solved the problem of evil. The problem of evil is that how do you reconcile moral goodness with the amount of suffering, right? And the only way you can do that is actually prove that the suffering isn't bad, or God is good and it accounts for it through some explanation. And I can't see how by appealing to ignorance does that. By appealing to ignorance,
Right.
you've just
You'll have to at least provide
Yeah.
evidence for theodicies that you provide, and basically
and explain it in some sort of way
and
that
explain it in some coherent way, basically. Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
furthermore, one more point, Madan, that the time that you cite these kind of incidences, right, for any philosopher like Bill Craig or anybody else, any theistic philosopher, when you're citing these kind of horrible, that we consider horrible incidences, right? They can't use that term horrible that we atheists use pretty much, right? They should say, oh, that was a good incident because God commanded it, right? If they have to be really consistent with their own, uh, theology, pretty much, right? They shouldn't say that Canaanite massacre was a horrible thing, right? It was a good thing, basically, right? Same, they could have said, I shouldn't go any further than that, probably shouldn't bring any other examples there. But you see my point, right?
Yes.
All right, shall we move on then? Anyone wants to add any further points? I think we dug quite deep into these points, but if you want to add, all right, let's move on then.
Permit things like the killing of innocent children by an Israelite clan. Maybe that is just okay. But the problems this raises include things like this is raised by Randall Rouser. He points out that this seems to undermine our ability to trust moral intuition. In other contexts, such as in the moral argument for the existence of God, you might appeal to the fact that we all know that certain things are morally right and morally wrong, and we sort of use that feeling to say that there must be some objective element of morality in the universe, and we use that to construct an argument for the existence of God. It seems, as Rauser points out, that nothing could be more intuitively wrong to me in this regard than the killing of an innocent child. And what we're told to believe is that, okay, maybe most of the time that's wrong. Maybe that's always wrong unless it's specifically commanded by God. But sometimes it is actually just okay as long as God commands it, meaning that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with killing innocent children. It can't be intrinsically wrong if there are circumstances in which it's actually not just permitted, but in fact the thing that you're ordered to do.
I would say that it is wrong in the absence of a divine command, but that God has the ability to override that by issuing a divine command, which then becomes our moral.
Did he say it is wrong in the absence of divine command?
Yes.
On what basis does he say that?
Yes, he says that. And I think you'll see that that is his overall theory. He's saying that
So,
in our moral
yeah.
intuition, I think what his view is that our moral intuitions are generally
So
a good guide
reliable, right?
for
Yeah.
a reliable moral compass. It's a good guide as to what is good and evil. But in when there is a divine command specifically, or explicit divine command that is received, in that case you'll have to follow that divine command.
All right. Okay. That makes
But
sense then. Then
but
yeah.
but still, I think he's not answered Alex's question. Killing children, according to his worldview, William Lane Craig's worldview, is not intrinsically wrong. He says it is wrong in the absence of a divine command, which means it is not intrinsically wrong. It is just wrong until God decides to command otherwise. That is what he means.
Right.
So
Right. I
therefore,
mean, yeah.
and
That's
both
obvious
are God's
with what he
commands.
said, basically.
Exactly,
Right. Right.
exactly. So it's not in we might miss that he does not say that it is intrinsically wrong. He cannot say that,
Right. Right.
because
Right.
God can sometimes command you to
On
kill
his,
children,
yeah.
and sometimes he can command you to not kill children.
Exactly. Right. Right. Right.
Duty. And as long as this ethical theory is possible um, and coherent, then there just is no inconsistency between his being all good and all loving and his issuing a command of this sort. In the absence of a divine command, as I say, it could well have been immoral. But given the presence of divine command, it becomes the moral obligation of those persons to whom it was issued.
Now,
So it doesn't undermine our moral intuitions about what's right and wrong. It just introduces the qualification of a divine command.
but it would mean that
can override that.
there's nothing intrinsically wrong with taking the life of an innocent child. Nothing intrinsically wrong with doing
Well, again, this is going to depend on your moral theory, Alex. I think that right and wrong, moral obligations, are determined by imperatives issued by a qualified authority. And so, in the absence of such imperatives, there literally is no right and wrong. It's a subjective illusion of human consciousness. And I think this is one of the real problems of atheism, is that lacking a moral lawgiver and moral authority, it has no basis for affirming objective right and wrong. These are just either patterns of behavior that have emerged from the socio-biological pressures of the evolutionary process, or else they're expressions of personal preference and taste. In neither case, then, are they normative. So, in the absence of a moral authority to issue these imperatives, there wouldn't be any objective right or wrong. But given such a divine moral lawgiver, there is objective right and wrong. But that moral lawgiver himself doesn't have the same moral obligations that we do.
I suppose if I'm being asked to accept wholesale a biblical morality, I suppose I would look at something like this and, as Lincoln said of slavery, think, if this is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. I mean, maybe I can't make a moral claim. Maybe I can't say that there is such thing as morality and immorality in the universe, but something inside of me tells me that if there is such thing as ethics, it can't look like this. In other words, you're asking me, in order to accept the justification for the actions in this story, to deny one of the most forceful moral intuitions, the exact kind of moral intuition which you might ask me to rely upon in other contexts to establish God's existence at all.
Yes, and as I say, I affirm that moral intuition. If these actions had been undertaken in the absence of a divine command, it would be objectively wrong. But the point would be is that on a divine command theory of ethics, God is free to issue a command that goes against that, so long as it is consistent with his just and loving nature. And so the burden here would be to show that in issuing this command, God does something that contradicts his perfectly just and loving nature. And my argument is that that's very difficult to show because he doesn't wrong anyone, I think, in this. In particular, the
Can you pause
difficult
it over here?
case here is the children. And what I would
Because I
say
think,
is,
yeah, because I think he'll start a new point over here. I have 2 points here to raise. One is, if a person who believes William Lane Craig's worldview, if he has that worldview of or he follows that moral understanding, that moral intuitions are generally a good guide, but sometimes, if in the presence of a specific divine command, God could command us to go against our moral intuitions. My question then would be, how can a person, given this theory, declare anyone or anyone's action evil? Because you could, or that person, maybe that's just a possibility. We can think of the most evil person in history. I'm not naming anyone, but let's not name anyone, because there is a risk of demonetization. So let's just consider a person who has committed the most atrocious brutalities in human history. Now, one could always argue, well, actually, maybe he was divinely commanded to carry out those actions and not tell anyone. He was told to do so, and he was commanded by God to do so. We can never declare him evil, because maybe God commanded him to carry out all those things that were seemingly evil or bad. Maybe that was the case. And in that case, you can never declare any action on any person evil, or any person evil, no matter how many evil acts that person has done. Although you could still, given that the worldly laws that we have, you could even punish him. But yet you could say that, well, these are the worldly laws that we are following to punish him. We cannot truly declare that person evil, because we are not sure whether he was divinely commanded, or maybe he was. What do you think?
Right, right. I think this is one problem, probably even uh, sorry, Alex is gonna raise later on. Maybe he does not raise that problem, but that problem is always there. I think he brings in the point of those that 2004 case where a woman killed her own children, probably three children or something like that,
Yes, exactly.
where she thought that she was being commanded by God to carry out, you know, and she was being commanded by God basically to carry
Exactly.
out these
But
killings,
even
basically.
in that case, she told that he has she, that no, she thinks that
Yeah,
she
yeah.
has been
I mean,
divinely commanded.
I'm just
I'm saying,
your case,
yeah, I'm
yeah,
even
builds on
giving
that
another,
basically.
yeah,
Yeah,
I'm building on that and giving another possible scenario
case
where a
basically,
person
a
might
plausible
have been,
case basically.
exactly, where a person might have been explicitly instructed by God to not tell anyone that this is a divine command. And there's nothing that goes against divine nature, that he must, any command that he gives to any person, humans is obliged to give it to tell it to anyone. But no, that might not be the case with everyone. Maybe he was given that instruction to not tell anyone explicitly that this was a divine command, and that was his test. Well, fine. Then you can never declare anyone truly evil. You should not consider, or consider anyone as evil, because you would never know whether he was divinely commanded or not.
I can't hear. Can
So
you hear? Can you hear
I don't
Cali?
know. No, I can't. So I think Kylie was
Cali.
Kylie was simply saying something about one of the issues of skeptical theism is that if you can't determine um, moral or immoral actions simply because you can't there might be a greater good or some sort of moral justification that is beyond your ken, meaning that if we are finite in our imaginations and there could have been things that we've not seen, which is what many of the defenders of theism raise as an objection to the problem of evil, that given that God is an infinitely knowledgeable being, given that we're finite, there might be things that are beyond our understanding that are in operation that would actually justify things. And had we had that understanding, then we would understand why God's commands were this way, or why there was this evil, why the deer in the in the forest died in a painful way, when it didn't make any difference, a gratuitous suffering. Well, it wasn't gratuitous after all. Apparently, there will be a justification that if we had possessed God's intelligence and understanding and wisdom, we would know, but we don't possess it. But some of the reductos from this that you have to, if you follow the logic of this line of thinking, is that we end up again similar to what I said before in moral ignorance, that any action, any inaction, any person's behavior, every time something happens in the world, we don't know whether that's actually happening for a greater good. So if right now, for example, if there's a war crime, what we consider to be a war crime being committed, and there are X, Y, Z happening, atrocities happening, and it seems like the clearest case of an atrocity, well, it could be for a greater good, and therefore we can never, stop and say this is happening this is evil,
For
this is
bad,
bad,
or evil, right? Yeah.
In fact, it leads to moral paralysis in the following sense. Suppose somebody jumps into a river and is there, and they're suffering in the river, and they're about to die.
And drowning, basically, right?
Yeah, and should you
So
go and save this person? Well, it could be the case that if you must jump and save this person because it's a good thing to do. But if you don't do anything, that also might be due to a good thing, right? Because
Right.
his death might be for a greater good. There might be some mysterious reason that explains it. So
Right.
action or inaction, is okay here. In other words, what this stops you to doing is making any moral judgments entirely, right? So you end up in a moral
Exactly.
blind spot. There are ways around that. There are things that Bill Craig could say against this, in the sense that, from God's perspective, He knows what the beyond your ken reasons are, but you don't. So you need to operate in a way that you don't know that yet, right? And insofar that you do know, God has commanded you to rescue the person. Insofar of what you do know, God has said that, like Kylie's example, if somebody goes and murders somebody and he or she claims that there is a God doing it, what you know from biblical texts and so on is that God doesn't willy-nilly do this, right? The God of the Bible doesn't allow for that so far. So although there are beyond your ken reasons, you're not privy to them, and you're not the decider of what those are likely to be. So he can come out with these sort of justifications, I think, and so on. But it's not necessarily completely persuasive, because when you support it with an additional argument that Stephen Law has made, that it leads to the Pandora's box objection, which leads to total lack of knowledge of all sorts. If it is the case that there can be beyond your ken reasons for things, God could have beyond your ken reasons for deceiving you with the Bible. So that as a source falls apart in the first place, right? So you cannot rely on anything. In fact, the beyond, as Stephen Law has made, for the beyond your ken reasons, the mysterious reasons, the skeptical theism is an equal possibility on an evil God. If there's an evil God, then there could be beyond your ken reasons, mysterious reasons why evil God came in the form of Jesus Christ and wrote the Bible, or inspired the Bible. And all of that could be
all those stories could be fit into the same narrative, pretty much. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's that paralysis is still there. So this leads to a total epistemic, maybe even nihilism, right?
Yeah.
Total epistemic nihilism to the extent where everything and anything is beyond your knowledge. So going down the route of skeptical theism for theists leads to the problems of total knowledge nihilism, right? Because where do you stop this defense of there might be a mysterious reason for why the evidence is this way. So even the clearest case, man stabs a woman dies. It looks like it's unjust. It looks like there's no higher moral ground justification. There's no utilitarian benefit. At least that's the obvious. Well, William Lane Craig would say there might be reasons beyond our ken, mysterious reasons that we don't know yet, right? But if you go down that route, then you can say that about anything, including your senses, including science, including whether the sun, the sun is thermonuclear, including the Kalam cosmological argument, right? Yeah, once you prove in the Kalam cosmological argument, somebody might say, well, although it looks apparent that the existence of God is the conclusion of the Kalam cosmological argument, maybe there are beyond your ken reasons why it's false. Yeah, and therefore we can never conclude God exists, because there might be mysterious reasons beyond your ken. Now, what William Lane Craig might say that you can't say that is because if God exists, then we know that there's an infinite array of possibilities that are in his knowledge that you as a finite being cannot conclude, and therefore he may hold those reasons. But if Kalam, etc., you don't have the same reality for other things. But no, you do, right? The same sort of knowledge gap that we have between us and God. There's the same sort of knowledge gap you may have with that and an evil God, and to no God. You might have a knowledge gap between naturalism and yourself, right? There might be reasons due to naturalism that, natural reasons that are beyond our ken in an infinite universe, let's say, that explains everything, yeah, to satisfactory level under atheism.
Right.
And and if that's the case, even if William Lane Craig proves the Kalam cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, the moral argument, all of these things, we could still say it still might be true under naturalism, because there might be beyond your ken reasons under naturalism. Because the knowledge gap between us in our fine, tiny, puny imagination and the actual reality of naturalism, the gap, means that we can never. And in philosophy, it's called I think a nauseam inference. I forgot what it's called. It's when you can make a justified inference based on the knowledge that you possess. So I can make a justified inference that when I look in my fridge, there is no milk. But I can't make a justified inference that when I look at planet Mars, that there are no aliens on there. Why? Because there's a difference of there's a gap. I've not been to Mars. I don't have any knowledge of Mars. Whilst I can conclude that there's nothing in my fridge because I've looked at the fridge cleanly, my intellectual abilities are able to determine there's nothing in the fridge. I can't conclude there's nothing on Mars because there's a knowledge gap. Yeah. So in philosophy, that sort of model is used to explain skeptical theism in the term of God, in the sense of it's God, right? But that sort of skeptical theism can be used for skeptical atheism, right? The same knowledge gap point can be made. Sorry, go on.
No, you were wondering what it is called. You were right. It's called a nauseam inference. Basically, yes. It's not there if you can't see it. Basically, something like that, right?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Sorry, I just wanted to say that. You wanted to finish that thought and then.
No, I was just propping up. I was just propping up Kyla's points that there could be mysterious reasons, and I was just making it stronger to say that they could these ideas that there can be mysterious reasons for anything and everything goes in every direction, for the evil God, for evil actions by people, and for naturalism, right? There could be mysterious reasons on naturalism that we're not privy to because there's a gap between us and the reality, and therefore this sort of argument leads to this sort of inconsistency problems where the theist is not consistently applying this objection, because if he applied the objection consistently, he would have to say that he can't conclude that there is no evil God, and in fact he can't even conclude the existence of God, and he can't even conclude the the falsity of naturalism. Right? He'll be in
Right,
epistemic nihilism, I think, some sort of epistemic nihilism.
right. Callie, are you back?
Yep, I'm here.
All right. Yeah, you wanted to add or finish your point? Madan
No, I
did
think Madan has
yeah,
explained
Madan
it a lot
did
better
finish
than I did.
your point. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
But I think
All right.
another point, I'm not sure if you guys did discuss that in my absence. I'm not sure. Is that what William Lane Craig is not actually responding to is cosmic skeptics' question about, you know, um theists use the moral argument and they appeal to our moral intuition as a basis of that moral argument. If, according to William Lane Craig, those moral intuitions are not reliable, are not completely reliable at least, then in that case, why, then, they cannot, have their cake and eat it too. Either they would claim that we might not be able to understand God's reasons for agreeing certain moral rules, and they cannot at the same time give our moral intuitions or provide our moral intuitions as an argument for God. I mean, you cannot play that game from both ends, from both sides. So I think that is, and William Lane Craig is not responding to that right now. He's just claiming that, well, it's not inconsistent logically. It's not inconsistent that God's nature, it's not. So he's sort of responding to the problem of evil, and he's claiming that it is not inconsistent with God's nature or God's goodness because it is by definition whatever God does is good or whatever God decrees is good. But he's not responding to the question that why then theists usually present moral argument from morality as a proof of existence of God, and whether they should stop doing that. If, or at least someone who believes in the worldview that William Lane Craig has, they should not present moral argument as an argument for existence of God.
All right. Yeah, Callie, good point. Uh, let's welcome Ugba. Ugba, how are you, mate?
Hi, Philo. Hi, Martin. Hi, Kat. How are you guys? I'm good.
Hey, yeah. How are you?
I'm good.
All right. Yeah, Madan asked for you. Madan talked about you probably about half an hour back or so, I think.
Mm.
So,
It's
and
good,
I think,
it's good to see him after a long time.
Yeah,
yeah, I
yeah.
think we've been streaming. Sorry, Madan, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, yeah, you too. Are you sure you're good, Ukba? Because apparently we can't determine that. Whether we're good or not. We have something, right, apart from that which is God's, bestowed.
What is good?
Ukba is blah blah.
Ugba is blah blah.
Yeah.
Okay, it seems like Ugba is confused because he didn't hear us probably past 30 minutes or so.
No, I think he
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
Okay,
Didn't he?
he did. Okay, I didn't. I don't know. I'm not too sure. He'll be the one who will tell.
Yeah. Hmm.
All right, shall we move on then? Move ahead with the.
Yes.
I think
Yeah,
Ukba is
let's
on
continue.
mute. If he's trying to say something, he doesn't know that he's on mute.
Yeah, you're on mute if you were saying something. We couldn't hear.
No.
Wanted
I
to
was
add
ready
something
to.
to the discussion?
No, guys, go ahead. Because I haven't watched
Or,
this video. I saw it on
all right.
Twitter and
You
they were
you
doing
you haven't
memes
heard
about
us
it.
so far as well, right? Okay, that's why you didn't
Yes,
get that joke. But Madin joke, blah blah blah.
I was with Asdak and Ali Safin. I'll tell you about
All
it at
right,
the
all
back.
right. Yeah, we'll probably talk about all that maybe in the backstage, maybe. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I think that's better, right? Okay, let's move on then.
Is first that God has the right to take anyone's life whenever he wants to. Unfortunately, children die all the time in infancy. And so if God wants to end the life of these Canaanite children early, prematurely, that's his prerogative. But then secondly, on my theology, these children go immediately to heaven. They go to be with God and therefore come to know a life that is more glorious and more happy than anything conceivable and certainly far better than if they had been allowed to live and be raised in such a corrupt and evil.
I think the point to be noticed over here is, as soon as he says that, in my theology, God allows kids to be, kids to die in infancy and whatever, right? Many kids die in infancy and all those. I mean, he could just stop there because that's his, he believes in that divine command, right? And even if God doesn't give any justification, he should say it's all good because God commands it. Now, because his internal, whatever you can say, internal moral compass kicks in, he starts to justify that, okay, these are the things that, I mean, of course, they are. It's not that they are not written over there. I mean, that's what the theology says. So, but even if the theology didn't say all those things, he would still be saying, "Oh, it's all good thing," basically because God commanded it, right? So I think just wanted to make that point that he makes it sound as if killing children is good because you'll get greater life, greater good out of that. I think we already discussed all those things earlier as well.
Exactly. And I'll tell you,
Environment as they
sorry,
were in. So it was
Sorry,
actually
sorry.
yes. So I wanted to say that even I think Alex earlier, maybe earlier or later on, mentions that, if you have this divine command, morality, worldview, then you don't even have to declare that Canaanites were all these evil people. You don't even declare them evil per se. You could say, well, whoever, maybe they were the most pious people on the earth at that time. Even then, God
Exactly,
could have
exactly,
decreed for Israelites to attack them and kill each and every one of them. Why? Because God could decree that. By definition, whatever God asks people to do is good. Anyways, God decreed the Israelites to murder children and animals, right? And William Lane Craig is trying to explain that away by telling, well, it was a blessing and God has the prerogative to decree whatever he wants to, or whatever is in line with his nature, of course. But in other words, whatever he decrees is good. So he could have decreed Israelites to kill Canaanites, or despite the fact, despite it being that the Canaanites were the most pious people of the on the planet at the time. Yet William Lane Craig would still be defending Israelites, or God, his God's commands, because he would say, well, God has a prerogative to command anything, because whatever he commands is by definition good. So I think, yeah, he don't even have to go and declare Canaanites as evil, if he has that worldview.
Because I think that this is similar to the problem, the attribute of justice that we discussed about the Islamic version of God, which is that if the purpose of creation is to test humans, then why did God created these babies which die early on? Similarly, in Christianity, if the purpose of creation is to express God's love, then why can't God just create it? Why couldn't God create these babies in heaven instead of letting them suffer through
Yeah,
these circumstances?
I
Exactly.
think I was talking about this point with Mahadin, I think, before the stream started. And then I wasn't too sure whether the test was the primary point. The salvation was probably the primary point in Christianity, as opposed to, Islamic
I think
theology,
one
right?
could ask that did they actually it was it necessary for them to go through that suffering to attain salvation?
Exactly. Why create this world at all with all this suffering? If God could create beings without, he could have created the humans directly in the paradise, all not requiring salvation at all, enjoying heaven directly without going through all the suffering. Why doesn't he do that with everyone? That is a simple question. If he can kill babies, in their childhood, and having, let's say, a baby who dies on average, if we analyze all the babies who die young, or at a very young age, and we analyze all the humans who die at a later stage, I think we could easily say that on average, people who die at a later stage go through a lot more suffering. Why? Because we see that they can, even all the babies, the kinds of deaths that they have, Even adults have those kinds of deaths. So on average, their suffering seems equal, but not equal. I mean, at least the suffering of death. But since an adult who dies at a later stage goes through this life with all this suffering, then the question would be, why does God need to allow all of this suffering and only allow salvation after human has gone through all of this suffering? Just why doesn't he directly just creates all of these humans in paradise where they can enjoy their existence?
I think he'll respond to this by saying that there's no reason, and he's
Yeah.
not under any obligation to tell us.
Eh, are you taking the Ghazali's view? Do you think he believes in the Ghazali's view?
Exactly.
He has no reason to do the things that he do.
But how did he respond to the objection that if God is free from all obligation, then how are we sure that God didn't lie to us, or God can't lie? How can we eliminate the possibility of lying from it? Because this is one of the core issues in Islamic theology. I don't know how Christian theologians
Yeah.
dealt with this.
Yeah. I don't think he deal with that in this video. I'm not sure how he generally deals with it though,
I
because he
think I
cannot say
think
that.
he has to take that as axiomatic, or whatever. It's built in his nature. He doesn't lie,
Again,
probably. Yeah,
so that's just like,
probably. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
But we
I'm
have to
assuming,
disagree
but
that
I'm not
renders
quite sure
the
about that.
definition of omnipotence tautology. Tautologic.
Right, right. Madan, you're on mute, so you want to say something, add something.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say a few, just maybe reiterate or say the same thing in a different way that we've already said. Um, just basically, when we think about this problem of evil type of things, we need another way of thinking about it is that how can we best differentiate it from an evil God hypothesis, right? Like, can the same things be said about an evil God? The same sort of justifications that Bill Craig is saying, right? So
Just exactly mirroring them, right? Yeah.
yeah. So is the worldly data that we're saying, like the Canaanites and all this genocide, whatever you want to call it, is this more fitting for a Bill Craig type of God or an evil God? And how do we help delineate between the two hypotheses? Like, does the data fit one better than the other? And given that all of these explanations that Bill Craig is saying can be mirrored for the evil God, it is sufficient for keeping the problem of evil alive. Remember, the problem of evil is solved if we can show that the suffering is reconcilable with a good God. Yeah, or there isn't any suffering. Yeah, something like that. And the problem of evil remains at bay if definitely if the evil is not reconcilable with a good God. Yeah, that there can not be any excuse to explain how the suffering is consistent with a good God, or because we can't explain it. We can't explain how it is reconcilable with a good God. So that doesn't mean it's not reconcilable. It's just we can't explain how. And a lot of these the things that Bill Craig is saying in the end, and other theists say, kind of reverts to that kind of skeptical theism, mysterious God. Like, we don't know the reason. Just like you guys have said it a second before I started. Like God might have a reason that we just don't know why. Why he didn't want to send people to heaven. Why he didn't want to just just try this alternative way of doing things instead of doing it this way, right? That still keeps the problem. You've not solved the problem of evil. You've just said you're ignorant about it, but it's still alive, right? It's still a problem, because now you're just saying there's all this suffering in it, and we don't know how it's reconcilable with a good God. Well, that means it's still
Yeah,
possible.
there is a greater good. We don't know
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, yeah. The idea that there is it could be a greater good. It could be some other stuff
Yeah,
as
yeah.
well.
That's one of the possibilities, basically. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It can somehow be reconcilable with a good God, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not solve the problem of evil, right? Because then when the theist then stops and starts praying to God or something, he's actually positively believing God is good. And that's the whole point of the problem of evil, to prove God is good, right? Is to solve it. And so that actually this evil is explainable away. It can be explained away. God is good. Until and unless you show that God is good, any other move doesn't solve the problem of evil. You have to prove God is good. So saying like mysterious stuff, it doesn't prove God is good. It just says it could be the case that there's a mysterious reason. But remember, it doesn't differentiate from the evil God hypothesis. There could be an evil reason as well. There could be a mysterious evil reason. There could be a greater good, or there could be a greater evil. And you have
Exactly.
to, right? So until and unless you've exclusively shown, unconditionally shown that indeed God is good, you've not solved the problem of evil. And I would say then the best, and this is kind of where the philosophical literature on this stops. It kind of stops at the best arguments stop at God, that we can't really tell. That's the best defense theists have, that all of this stuff looks evil, but there might be some mysterious reason that makes it consistent with his character, right? But that's not an positive reason showing that it is consistent with his character. It might be consistent with his character, because it might also be consistent with the evil God character. And you can't disprove the evil God, just like you're trying to say that we can't disprove a good God. And the reason we can't disprove a good God is because it might be consistent with his character, but it might not be. Then you can't similarly, in parallel, disprove an evil God. As long as that's alive, the problem of evil is still alive. And maybe theists at that point use faith to bridge the gap, but then they stop doing philosophy. Remember, we're having a philosophical discussion. If you can do it by faith, then we won't be even talk about any of this, because anything can be made up by faith. But is it intellectually defensible? And no. So I think to this day, the problem of evil has not been solved. It's not been intellectually defended by showing that God is indeed good.
Yeah, unfortunately, though, theists claim that a problem of evil has been long solved and all those things, and still, yeah, I mean, it's, yeah, I think
at best they've put forward potential solutions in theory.
Solutions, right. That's what they mean. They think they have won, but then, yeah, I mean, they have solved it, but
yeah. Let me
that's
repeat
exactly
though.
is what is happening.
What they've put forward is theoretical solutions that might be true. That's it. That's the best that they've come. They've not solved anything.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on.
Tremendous blessing to these children for them to be killed and go to heaven and be with God.
You must understand how that sounds, saying it was a blessing for these children to be killed and go to God. I mean, this is something that Dawkins quotes you on directly, and I'm interested in you share my assessment here that even if he's not correct, I can understand why he would hear you say something like that and think that it's morally repugnant, that it's revolting. In any other context, if somebody says something like, well, maybe the murder of these children, I suppose you wouldn't see it as murder, but the killing of these innocent children is a blessing to them. It just seems again to run against our intuitions. I mean, you mentioned
doesn't it, Alex? I mean, I think it runs against our naturalistic worldview, where one doesn't believe in an afterlife. But on a theistic worldview, if these children go to a life more glorious and happy than they can imagine, then it is a great blessing. It's just that modern man doesn't believe that.
There are a few ways that I would maybe respond to that. The first is to say that there are areas like take the issue of abortion, for example. Now, you might think that it's immoral to have an abortion because God has commanded that you shouldn't take innocent life, in the absence of some specific divine command, sure. But a lot of the time in this discussion, people do talk in language which points to how this is bad for the child. You're taking away the life of a child. You're committing some wrong towards the child. This position that you're advocating here would seem to remove the ability to do that. You can still say that abortion is wrong if you like, but you can't say that it in any way harms the child. In fact, it seems like you're committed to the view that it confers a great good upon the child when a parent has
absolutely.
Abortion.
I mean, what it would do would rob the child of the goods of this finite life that he would have enjoyed had he lived 50, 60 years or so. But in place of that, it gives him an eternal life of incomprehensible joy and happiness, which far outbalances the loss of those finite goods. So the reason that abortion is wrong is not because it's bad for the victims. The reason it's wrong is because it transgresses a divine command. It's homicide, and God has commanded us not to commit homicide in the absence of some overriding moral justification, like a policeman or a soldier who needs to take life in order to save life. So it gets back again, Alex, to your ethical theory. Whence do moral obligations arise? And I cannot think of any source for moral obligations more plausible than that these arise as a result of imperatives issued by a qualified authority, in this case, the good himself.
I suppose I have a few things to say. One is that this seems to, you've talked about this in relation to children, the children who get killed, you're conferring a good upon them because they get to go to heaven. But this would surely apply just as much to the adult Canaanites as to the children. I mean, maybe all of the adult Canaanites were corrupt and evil, but if there were any good people among them, it seems like there would be no need to say, no, look how corrupt the society was, because, anybody who is innocent and good, if they get killed, well, they get to go to heaven too. So it seems like a bit of a disposal problem. Any time that there's any kind of slaughter which involves this serious challenge of innocent people being put to the sword on the command of a god, you can always just say, well, they go to heaven. So if anything, you've actually done them a favor. It seems like a bit of a disposal problem, a solution to a disposal problem. It seems like
disposal problem. What do you mean by that?
Like there's sort of this problem of where do these people go? What do we do with these good souls? And we just say, oh well, they just go to heaven. I mean, it seems like a difficult pill to swallow. And what I was wondering is if, despite what your philosophy is, do you understand that intuition? Do you understand why when Richard Dawkins looks at this and thinks it's
myself, it's so powerful? But boy, just to reiterate again, what is the problem here? The problem is whether or not there is an internal inconsistency in the Judeo-Christian worldview between affirming that God is all good and all just and affirming that God commanded Israel to drive the Canaanites on pain of death out of the land. And so the question is not, are
right. So let me just put forward a more of an argument here that I think is gonna really get at Craig, precisely because he keeps echoing this, and we've just talked about possibilities here in different, like if we go down that route, the mysterious God objection, then this happens, but we've not explained why it is actually internally inconsistent. We just said, all right, we can make an argument that it is internally inconsistent, but if then William Lane Craig says we can never do this simply because God's understanding of justice and stuff is just different, and this is why there's no inconsistency. God is good and all this stuff and so on. So then what we do is then we shift and we start talking about, all right, let's bite the bullet and think skeptical theism or whatever it is. Let's bite the bullet and go down the route of these concepts of justness and stuff like that are incomprehensible or something, or we can never assess it because it's just going to be somehow by definition always consistent, then we have this kind of ignorant, we're in epistemic nihilism, basically. We're ignorant about things, and we can never, then the problem is for the theist that they can never confirm God is good. They just believe it, but they have no reason to believe that, no intellectual defense for that, right? I know Alex hasn't put it forward like that, but let's just actually try and defend the idea that it actually is internally incoherent. If we have to go down that route, the first one, right? And the reason is that William Lane Craig is saying that God is just, God is good, and God is good, and therefore God is just, benevolent, loving, merciful, and by definition, if there's a genocide, then if God is the one to command the genocide through those attributes, it must it's like an analytical truth. It's like a square must have four sides. The outcome, the genocide, has to be consistent with those attributes, right? Here's the weakness of his point here. Like Kylie and I, we've discussed before, the only way you can do this is by kind of saying that these concepts are not. Soon as there's a conflict between our human understanding of these concepts, he's going to appeal to that. He's going to appeal to the idea that God's fairness is just beyond our understanding. It has to be. Otherwise, I don't understand how he's going to reconcile that. Right? Now, if that's what he's going to do, and I think that's what he does in elsewhere, then it creates this problem. Right? When William Lane Craig makes the argument for, let's say, actual infinites are metaphysically impossible, right? We can just say that no, by definition, an actual infinite is coherent, because if actual infinites can be consistent with reality or something like that, or actual infinites by definition must be true, then there's no inconsistency, right? So William Lane Craig might raise like Hilbert's Hotel or other problems or other metaphysical problems to raise it, and we will say actually no, there is no issues. And if he keeps pressing, but there's a logical contradiction here, or there's a metaphysical absurdity. Look, you can't add to an infinity, you can't subtract an infinity. We can just appeal to the fact that an infinity is beyond our comprehension, and there might be some consistency or something like that.
It's a mystery, right? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, because it's beyond your ken, it's just beyond us,
Mm-hmm.
and so therefore it's internally consistent. There's no contradiction.
Right.
It's completely
Right.
consistent. So William Lane Craig will have to let go of that, in which case he can't prove the existence of God. His case depends upon that to some extent, a lot of his arguments. But if he
Exactly.
doesn't let go of that for the same reason, yeah, and if he says that he can actually assess infinite attributes of an infinity with his puny imagination, with his finite imagination, he can find a contradiction in an infinity. And why can't we, using our puny imagination, find a contradiction between infinite fairness and a genocide? Right?
Exactly.
He's stuck in a bind here. Either we can do that. So he has to. So it's like a symmetry problem now. Like a symmetry. He needs a symmetry breaker, right?
Right. Right.
He needs a symmetry breaker. He has to show what's different here. Right? Either we can do that and analyze God's justice and mercy and compassion and see that, in fact, is in contradiction with the genocide. God could have done all of these alternative things. Either we can do that or we can't do that. But if we can't do that, then William Lane Craig can't rule out an actual infinite elsewhere for the same reasons, because that's what he's doing ultimately in different places. Right?
Right. Right. Exactly. All right.
I would
Anybody else wants to add
Yes.
something? Kelly? Yeah.
No, I totally agree
also,
with him, with Mahadan. Yes.
yes,
All right.
I also agree with him. I would just want to add that if, according to Craig, if killing children results in them attaining eternal pleasure, bliss, and salvation, then shouldn't all humans kill all children in the world? Because we
Ugba,
will
I can't hear
He
you properly. Ugba?
okay. So I think Ugba is saying that. Sorry. By saying that if, according to William Lane Craig, it is a great blessing on these children, that someone actually killed them while they were young, because now they're they end up in heaven. Then why don't everyone just start killing their children or something, something like
yes.
that.
So
So
given the
yeah,
evidence
he
we
does
have, we are
mention
under
that.
a
I think,
moral obligation for the greater good.
yeah, yeah. Bill Craig
Exactly.
responds to that later on. I think
He doesn't.
he
I
has.
mean, he tries to. No, he tries to. Respond. His response is again very weak. I would say he does not actually respond to it. He just say, no, no, no,
Right,
it's
right.
wrong because God decreed that it is wrong. So God has
Yeah, I
decreed,
mean,
or he decreed
his
against it.
response is really weak actually over there.
Yeah.
Basically, I mean, you can say, okay, you could still kill them.
Hmm.
Actually, a greater good is still achieved, right?
Exactly.
And yeah,
Exactly.
whatever the wrong was done was done. Let's say there is a some wrong been done, but the greater good was achieved,
I
basically,
mean,
right?
I would say that is the ultimate man. Let's say, just imagine a person who knows that if he kills children while they are young, they'll not have to go through all this suffering in this world, and they'll end up definitely and surely in heaven. So
Heaven,
that is a
right,
short way of making sure that all these children end up in heaven. And he knows also that this will be against God's command, and therefore he himself would be punished for that. And yet he says,
right.
okay, but for the sake of all these children's eternal
Children, I'll do that.
eternal bliss and eternal happiness, I will sacrifice myself, and I'm ready to go through that punishment.
Right,
Wouldn't you say that
exactly.
that
And
is
you
the
can
ultimate? Wouldn't you say that that is the ultimate form of compassion and selflessness? Wouldn't
exactly,
that
and
be
you
something
He
that
himself,
you
yeah,
would actually, yeah, hold in the most highest regard? Even the theist wouldn't say that. I'm just looking, and I'm not saying, I'm saying that isn't that something even theist would look at and say, well, this is the
this
ultimate
is the
form of
ultimate
compassion.
sacrifice, right? Ultimate
That is the
sacrifice,
ultimate
rather.
sacrifice. There can be
This is
no greater form of sacrifice.
second to the Christ on cross, basically.
Exactly,
You know.
exactly.
So
In fact,
what I wanted
Christ,
to say was
even
that,
even
yeah,
yeah,
what I
I'm saying
wanted
even
to add,
Christ didn't commit that sort of sacrifice. Exactly.
right?
yeah,
I
and
mean,
he has
But you're
himself
right. But
accepted.
you're right. But you're right. In fact, the sacrifice of Jesus would sort of be something, something like that, because he sacrificed himself to for the sins of others, and he would be sacrificing the person that we are talking about hypothetically. He would be sacrificing himself for the sake of for the sake of sins of the others. So I mean, this is something equivalent to that, and that should be considered and regarded as the ultimate form of selflessness and compassion.
exactly, exactly. Willing to suffer for eternity for others, pretty much, right?
Exactly, exactly.
And
There can be no
given
no
given
greater form
given
of compassion.
and given the trend that's been going on in the Christian culture, uh, if somebody says that probabilistically out of every 100 children, uh, 20 or 30 leave the religion by the age of 15 or so. I
Yeah,
mean, somebody would logically, and we are not saying, we are not promoting that kind of a thing. It's just a hypothetical question, which makes really good sense over here to counter Bill Craig, that if somebody takes that action thinking that, and doing all that math over there, he could just take that action and say, okay, yes, this is a good, this is for the greater good, pretty much, that all I'm doing is for a greater good. And he would be probably justified. You know. We are not saying that
Yes,
according to
because he
Bill Craig.
himself has said that
Yeah.
killing is permissible under circumstances where we have moral justification to do so. And in this circumstance, given the fact that we know that if we kill these children, then they'll certainly go to heaven, we are morally obliged to do so.
All right. Uh, Madan, you want to add something? Shall we? Uh,
No, let's just move on.
okay. All right.
These things true? Or did this really happen? It's only a question about, is there an inconsistency between those two propositions? And I think that given a divine command theory of morality, we can see that those propositions are quite consistent with each other. Now, that says nothing about whether or not it's true that when you die, you go to heaven, or that there is immortality beyond the grave, but those beliefs are part and parcel of the Christian, Judeo-Christian worldview. And so the question is, does the Judeo-Christian worldview have an inner inconsistency here? And although Dawkins himself has never interacted with my theory here, in my debate tour with his comrade, that yes, I have positions.
Dawkins quotes an article that you wrote in response to this issue, and I suppose I should read what the point that he pulled out, which summarizes his position here. You said, "So whom does God wrong in commanding the destruction of the Canaanites?
Right.
Not the Canaanite adults, for they were corrupt."
Yeah, before he just proceeds to explain what Dawkins is saying, I think on one level, Bill Craig talking about an internal consistency, resolving it in theory, is one way of defending it, but he has to also show the practical reality of it as well. So it's not sufficient for him to come out with a theodicy. He has to, let's say, he has to also show the empirical reality of the theodicy. Okay, because that's how we kind of move knowledge forward. We don't just think about a theoretical possibility that might reconcile it with a divine being, and therefore be internally coherent, internally consistent. But we also want to know whether or not that is manifested. And this is where my examples of comparing it to human cases explain. It's an analogy, not saying it's exactly the same. I talked about Jeffrey Dahmer before, and this
Right, right.
kind of explains it. Like, if Jeffrey Dahmer was a good person, then when he, by definition, he's a good person. Then when he goes and, let's say, commits an atrocity, that is going to be consistent with his, what do we do there? Does his atrocity confirm to us that he's not a good person anymore? But if we can be sure that he is a good person, then we have to
The act
think,
becomes good. Yeah.
yes, exactly. The atrocity becomes good, right?
Right.
Well, that's kind of where we are, though. We're not sure that he is a good person.
Right,
So,
right. I think this whole internal consistency thing, as you already mentioned, and I'm just probably repeating, could be applied to an evil god as well. So what?
Yes.
You can place an evil god, and it's completely internally consistent.
Yeah.
So
and
what? You haven't solved any problem,
exactly.
basically.
Yeah. Until and unless you say that an evil god doesn't exist, and only this good god exists, and that we can confirm that it is good, then we can maybe say this or that atrocity has to be good. But we're not in that position, right? He just comes out with this theoretical idea. So that's the first thing. Let me just, it's not all done. But then when you add the theodicy as well, that is also not confirmed. So when Jeffrey Dahmer may say, for example, the reason I committed this atrocity is so that let's say the reason I committed the atrocity is because I have a self-defense motivation. I did it out of self-defense, or something like that. But if Jeffrey Dahmer in a court of law can't prove that self-defense was at play here, then yes, in theory, if self-defense was in play, then he can be off the hook. It'll absolve him of this potential crime. But if he can't prove it in court, in that day, in that moment, then there is no self-defense motive. So there's no self-defense justification that succeeded in a court of law. And what are we going to conclude? In that moment, we're going to be like, no, you committed a crime. Your self-defense argument are poor. There's no evidence for it. And that's what the state that we are in right now. That's why it's called the problem of evil. The state that we are in right now is that God, seemingly God has created this world. There's a lot of evil, right? And then we ask, why is this evil happening? And we have a bunch of excuses, just like Jeffrey Dahmer can make a bunch of excuses. But they've not been proven to a sufficient standard in a court of law where we can empirically point out that, look, this is happening for this or that theodicy, or that these people are going to go to heaven. We don't know that. We're at this moment.
It's all theoretical. It's all theoretical.
It could be that we die and nobody will go to heaven, right? So that's one part of the problem of evil as well, that the heaven has not been confirmed. It's in theory, but it's not been confirmed. Or that theodicy that says it strengthens our hearts, builds our souls.
Soul building and all those things, right?
It's not been confirmed, right? Because there's plenty of horrendous atrocities that doesn't do that, where nobody's soul gets. There's plenty of animals dying in the wild, trillions of animals, right, who are suffering horrendous deaths without making a sound, and there's nobody there. And you can come up with theories like maybe there are invisible beings that their souls are being built. Maybe,
exactly.
Guess what? Alvin Plantinga makes that argument. Maybe there are angels that character that they modified. Yes, maybe. But shoulda, woulda, coulda. It's like that. It's like a maybe. It's an excuse. But there's no empirical evidence of those things. And therefore, it's still a problem. It's just like Jeffrey Dahmer making an excuse in a court of law. Or maybe I killed this woman. I did this to this woman, but for this reason. But if I can't prove the reason is a good reason, or that reason was in play, or self-defense, I can't prove it, then it's a bad reason still. You see that? And that's another way to approach this, I think.
I agree. All right, moving on.
Corrupt and deserving of judgment, not the children, for they inherit eternal life. So who is wronged? Ironically, I think the most difficult part of this whole debate is the apparent wrong done to the Israeli soldiers themselves. Yeah. Can you imagine what it would be like to have to break into some house and kill a terrified woman and her children? The brutalizing effect on these Israeli soldiers is disturbing. I must say that the disturbing thing to me there is I can't shake this feeling. And like I say, I have respect for you as a thinker and a philosopher, and I always enjoy our conversations. But hearing somebody talking about the slaughter of admittedly and explicitly innocent children, not to mention animals, as well as the eradication, driving out of an entire society, and to say that, well, the people who really suffered here were the soldiers who had to kill the innocent woman. It just, in a way that, like I said at the very beginning of this segment, there's nothing I can do strictly speaking to prove that there's no justification for this. But if there is anything that I've ever heard in my life that jumps out of a page with pure moral repugnance in the way that it meets my ears, it has to be something like that.
Well, I've really thought hard and dispassionately about this, Alex, and I tried to think as hard as I could, who has been wronged in this action? And it's very difficult to think of anyone who has been wronged by God in commanding this. And then it hit me, well, what about the Israeli soldiers themselves? Because we do know from soldiers who suffer from PTSD that the brutalizing effects of war upon soldiers is terrible and can be destructive. And so I explore at some length, what about the wrong done to these soldiers who had to carry out this command? Is there any motivation that might justify giving such a command to them? In the original article, I suggest that yes, indeed, there are goods that would be achieved by having them carry out this command, and that God would have morally sufficient reasons for doing that. That's in my original question of the week, number 16, if people are interested in following it up, where I argue that, in fact...
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
Could God do any better?
Yeah, exactly.
That's
Exactly.
right.
So who has been wronged? He keeps repeating who has been wrong, but the way to assess this is that the greater good that was given, let's say, to the soldiers or the babies, even with afterlife, could God have done this that is more consistent with his nature analytically when we use our finite imagination to assess this, which is what we should. Could God have done this alternatively and been more, and this would have been more consistent with his nature and more consistent with compassion, justice, and so on?
Right.
Or did he have to be a utilitarian? And no, he didn't have to be a utilitarian. Therefore, that is the wrong. That is the wrong. So everyone has been wronged here. So even one soldier, let's say, who was horrendously
Traumatized.
yeah, put in pain. Since God could have advocated,
Averted that,
yeah, diverted that, or just one mother who lost a child, right? Since God could have done this in a different way without causing this suffering, he's not justified doing it in that way. Now, a human being with his limited resources, limited imagination, when he's stuck with a trolley problem, let's say, and he has to pick between one or the other, and either kill one fat man or kill four individuals, maybe, and again, I'm not a utilitarian, but it's more persuasive here, the force of utilitarianism, because now you're stuck between limited choices with the limited resources, but God's not in that choice. God has infinite resources as long as they're logically possible. So he doesn't have to pick between causing some suffering, but then as a payment, get forever life.
Yeah, he could just save the fat man as well as the 3 lives.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
I mean, why not? I mean, we don't have a choice. He doesn't have to make a trolley. He doesn't have to make a trolley, basically. Yes.
Yeah.
Why run the trolley down that rail?
Exactly. So in this scenario, then God didn't have to make even tiny bit of pain. Yeah, any little bit of pain is morally inconsistent, right?
Exactly.
And forget gratuitous pain, and there's many gratuitous pains. And William Lane Craig, as Alex said, he's got this kind of special card to say, well, they were all granted heaven. It's like that's infinitely in his disposal. It's not just applicable to babies. It's applicable to the adult soldiers as well. And William Lane Craig nodded to that. He said, yeah, well, who's been wronged there? Well, if this was a finite being, maybe you could say this was the best result that could be achieved. Maybe. If there was a choice between infinite life and a little bit of suffering, maybe it's more persuasive for utilitarianism to work here. Even here, I'd be a bit, but I'm not going to go down that route right now. I don't need to. The point is, if you were a finite being, then utilitarianism like this seems more persuasive. But if you're an infinite being, you do not have to choose between some gratuitous pains to be inflicted now, but then you get infinite pleasure. Yeah, where you get infinite afterlife. You don't have to choose between that. You had the option to designing things completely differently, and if as long as that's a possibility, and you could have done that, then everybody was wronged.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. I wholeheartedly agree there. I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Ugba, you wanted to add something to that. Ugba, you're on mute.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that this question doesn't even make sense on divine command theory, because we have lost all sense of what's right and what's wrong, because if God dictates what's right and what's wrong, and we don't have any way to access that moral knowledge, then how can we even guess or even conceptualize that what could have been the better way?
Yeah. That's again.
Right, right.
I agree with that.
We
That's like a
discussed
language
that.
problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
So William Lane Craig is kind of sifting between different things, right? At some point, he's there saying that it just would be consistent with his just and loving nature, and then he's trying to say that he can't see anything that is inconsistent with his loving nature as well. When he says who has been wronged, he's trying to show, in other words, in essence, he's saying how is this inconsistent with his loving nature, right?
But
And
love,
yeah,
all
sorry,
these
go on.
become meaningless.
Yeah,
But don't
yeah,
these things become meaningless? Even justice becomes meaningless. And there is a
yeah,
huge debate about this in Islamic theology.
yes.
Right, right. Yeah, I think Ugba, you missed us talking about that part as well, right? I think we did discuss that part actually. So that the language problem, I think that's what the joke was about. Blah blah blah. I think that's why you didn't get that joke.
But how is it possible that Lane Craig himself is unable to see through this, that all these things
See,
become
you
meaningless?
once you are blinded by certain dogmatism, it's really hard to shake that off probably, and he's through that. I mean, he probably is a brilliant philosopher, but then you go down those routes where you just can't get past those things, and you in your mind you're thinking that you're internally completely coherent, and you don't see those problems. That's what I think probably. That's what is happening with him. It's
Yes,
probably
yes, yes.
a cognitive dissonance maybe of some sort. All right, shall we move on? Unless somebody else has any point to add.
Yeah, I'll just point out also the fact that, you know, I'm not sure William Lane Craig personally has ever done this, but many Christian preachers, Christians would object to, let's say, many events in the Islamic history, and they would declare that as if it's something immoral that was carried out by Muslims, and maybe they would point out some immoral acts in other religions as well. I think they've lost the ability, or they
The
would have
grounding,
no
basically, yeah.
the grounding to carry out any sort of moral criticism on any other religion if they have this theodicy. Because any religion can have this theodicy, and they can have justification for anything, no matter how atrocious it might seem. They can justify it on the basis of this explanation or this theodicy.
Exactly. I agree. All right. Shall we move on then? I think we still are left with some more of video. Let's run it.
Act, even the soldiers themselves would not be wronged by God issuing such a command. But I was looking for anybody that God had wronged. And, the atheist philosopher, British philosopher Daniel Came, responding to this sort of tiff between Dawkins and me, he said, I think that even though I'm not a Christian, he said Craig's position is entirely reasonable, that the children are not wronged in inheriting eternal life. We're all going to die. Someday many children do die, and God's taking the life of these children prematurely doesn't commit a wrong against them. It's actually, they're good. Now, don't let anybody say, oh, well, then we ought to go kill children. No, that would transgress a divine command against homicide. And therefore, in the absence of a divine command, that would be morally wrong. It is only given this divine command from the paradigm of goodness itself that one would be morally.
I think we already discussed this, and Bill Craig is not thinking through this, properly. I mean, you can, as we said, I mean, you could have 1,000 children being killed, and then under his theology, they would go to heaven. What's wrong in that? Greater good for greater number of people, pretty much, right? Or kids, rather, right? More in heaven. Wouldn't you like that? That's why you do, evangelism, pretty much. That's your goal, right? When you do, uh, when you perform evangelical duties, you want more and more number of people to go to heaven, right? That's your aim. That's your goal. And if somebody does that, thinking, taking the same logic ahead, right? I mean, you can say, yes, he probably did morally wrong in front of God, just one person, but a greater good has come about from that action.
Obligated to carry out such a horrific action.
But look, one of the things that Randall Ralston talks about as well is this example of someone who in 2004 committed infanticide, killed her own child,
Yes.
and says that she did so because she believed God was commanding her to. Now, it will be
Right.
easy enough to just say, I just don't think God was commanding her to. But the question I want to ask is, given everything you've just said, how can we know this? Because generally, if I ask
Yes.
somebody, look, if God told you to shoot up a primary school, would you do it? And what they tend to say is something like, well, I wouldn't believe that was God because that runs against his nature. The problem is
Yes.
that, sure, you might want to say that, just asking a mother to kill her child for no apparent reason might run against God's nature. It just seems to me that intuitively, if we didn't have this story in the Hebrew Bible, if the story of the Canaanites didn't exist, and we were speaking in the hypothetical, and I said, well, what if God told you to, I don't know, walk into somebody's land and not just drive them out, but if they refuse to go, to kill them, and then come back and kill the women and kill the children, and in fact kill the animals too, and if they leave the animals, they get punished for not killing the animals as well. What if he told you to do something like that? And I imagine the only thing somebody would be able to say is that, well, of course God wouldn't tell me to do that, and that's how I know that I wouldn't want to follow that command. But that's exactly what's happening here. So it leads us to a radical moral skepticism, in other words, is Rouser's critique.
Oh, I don't think it does that. But notice what you're raising here now is an epistemological question, not a meta-ethical question. This is now no longer a question about whether or not it would be right or even obligatory to carry out such a command. The question now you're raising is an epistemic question about how could I be sure that God has in fact issued such a command. And in the case that you mentioned of Andrea Yates, this was a severely mentally disturbed woman who was hearing voices and was schizophrenic. And it might well be the case that epistemically, Alex, that no one would be justified today in thinking that God had.
My question to Bill Craig would be, how would you know that those prophets that you think were prophets were not mentally, now because you have the technology so advanced, you can check, and, you have doctors who can do diagnoses and all those things. And so you know that, okay, somebody is probably mentally sick. In those days, probably the medical science was not that advanced that you would think that somebody is mentally that sick, right? I mean, sorry. I think that's a serious objection to Bill Craig, and probably in his defense that he would go to some prophecies and all those things that, okay, they came true, and that's why those books are true and all those things. But that's a pretty lame excuse in my opinion. What do you guys think, Madan?
Yeah. I'm not sure what the reasons he's going to. I think Bill Craig was going to proceed to explain, because he said in today's time it will probably be epistemically not possible to confirm that this has come from God, simply because it's unlikely or something like that. But I think he was proceeding to explain why before it probably was a higher, more likely, perhaps. I don't know.
Right.
Let's
I mean, I think I'm asking the reverse question to him. Basically, I mean, he's asking how would you, somebody is not getting a command from God. How did you determine that those were the prophets and they were not suffering from? So that's a good question to be asked to theists as well, basically, and their probably defense is, if you ask those questions to Muslims, they'll revert back and say, Madin, I'm getting feedback from you, sir. Okay, so if you ask that question to Muslims, they'll immediately say, okay, we have this book and we have these prophecies and the miraculous nature of the Quran, and then we have these, linguistic miracle and all those things, right? So that kind of gives a credence, basically. But then this question, underlying question, is always dodged, unless you go to someone like Hamza's Den, the speaker's corner guy, and he will always pose you those 2-3 questions. Okay, I just don't want to digress into another secondary point. Let's listen to what Bill Craig says and then maybe respond to it, right? But I think that's a fair objection to his point.
Issued such a command, it would be plausible to think that they ought to conclude that in fact they're hallucinatory or schizophrenic or mentally ill and go see a counselor. But that's an epistemic question about how did God communicate his revelation to Joshua and these Old Testament Israelites in such a self-authenticating way that there was no doubt that this was being commanded to them.
It is an epistemic question. It is an epistemic question here, but I suppose what I'm pointing out is an implication of this view, which is that at the very least, if I were to hear a very convincing voice tonight telling me to go and murder children in a primary school tomorrow, and I fully believed it was the voice of God when I woke up and I couldn't shake it, I could say, look, maybe I should go and get tested for. I feel fine. I feel rational. I seem rational. Maybe I should go and see if there's something wrong with my brain. But the one thing I can no longer do, I think, is say something like, I know I must be going crazy because God would never tell me to do something like that. I'd have to at least consider the possibility that God actually is telling me to go and do something like that, because there are instances in the Hebrew Bible where God does tell people to go and kill innocent children, and you would say justifiably so. So I'm removed of that ability to know for sure that I'm deluded.
Yes. Well, it's true that it would be possible, but as I say, there's nothing in the argument for the consistency of these propositions that would imply that anyone would ever be justified in believing that they had received such a command, because it would go against what our normal objective moral duties are. As you say, we have strong moral intuitions that taking innocent life is morally wrong. And so for us to believe that God is commanding us to do that would require just incredible, overwhelming justification. And it may well be the case that nobody today would have such a thing. That's just, I'm not interested in defending that epistemic question.
Just to be clear, where you said it's possible, you mean it is possible, even if, as you say, the epistemic question is a separate thing, whether we can know this is the case, it is possible that God could command something so intuitively immoral as walking into a primary school and shooting it up or something. It's possible that he could command such a thing.
Well,
it would be consistent with his nature, in other words.
Yeah, is it possible? That one seems to me to be plausibly contrary to his moral nature. But it is possible for God to issue commands that would override what our moral duties are. So, yeah, I would say that it is possible, but that's not to say that anyone would ever be justified in believing it.
Now, a final line of questioning here, because I know the time is short.
Can you pause it?
Yeah, finally, I mean, he woke
What did he just say?
Yeah.
Yeah, what did he just say at the end? That no one would be justified in believing that. What does he mean by that?
I think he's contradicting himself now. He contradicted.
No, it's not really.
What is he saying? What did he just say? At the end.
Contradiction. I'll tell you in what sense I'm thinking that's a contradiction.
Should we listen to it again?
Yeah,
maybe you have listened to it properly, then fine. But yeah, just slightly back. If you just do it.
To hear a very convincing voice telling me to go and.
Sorry, did anyone say anything? Ugba?
Yes, I said that he appealed to God's nature. I mean, if you are a divine command theorist, then how can you appeal to God's nature prior to receiving a divine command?
Right.
And also not only divine command theory, but you're also
he's talking about intuitions basically at that point, right?
Yes.
That there's strong intuitions, right? and then let's see if what I think is kind of a contradictory point, but I might be wrong here.
Murder children in a primary school tomorrow, and I fully believed it was the voice of God when I woke up, and I couldn't shake it. I could say, look, maybe I should go and get tested for. I feel fine. I feel rational. I seem rational. Maybe I should go and see if there's something wrong with my brain. But the one thing I can no longer do, I think, is say something like, I know I must be going crazy because God would never tell me to do something like that. I'd have to at least consider the possibility that God actually is telling me to go and do something like that, because there are instances in the Hebrew Bible where God does tell people to go and kill innocent children, and you would say justifiably so. So I'm removed of that ability to know for sure that I'm deluded.
Yes. Well, it's true that it would be possible, but as I say, there's nothing in the argument for the consistency of these propositions that would imply that anyone would ever be justified in believing that they had received such a command, because it would go against what our normal objective moral duties are. As you say, we have strong moral intuitions that taking innocent life is morally wrong. And so for us to believe that God is commanding us to do that would require just incredible, overwhelming justification. And it may well be the case that nobody today would have such a thing. That's just, I'm not interested in defending that epistemic question.
Just to be clear, where you said there, it's possible, you mean it is possible, even if, as you say, the epistemic question is a separate thing, whether we could know this is the case, it is possible that God could command something so intuitively immoral as walking into a primary school and shooting it up or something. It's possible that he could command such a thing.
Well,
it would be consistent with his nature, in other words.
Yeah, is it possible? That one seems to me to be plausibly contrary to his moral nature. But it is possible for God to issue commands that would override what our moral duties are. So,
Sure.
yeah, I would say that it is possible, but that's not to say that anyone would ever be justified in believing it.
Now, a final line of question.
All right. So, first thing, he did agree that's a possibility, at least possible. But why would not anybody justify it? He himself said that your divine command should supersede over your moral intuitions, right? Isn't that true? Now, once somebody thinks that he's receiving a divine command, shouldn't that somebody now be morally justified in carrying out that command, even if his moral intuition says no, this can't be true, basically, right?
Philo, can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah, sure.
Right. I'm not sure that it is a contradiction based on everything that he said. So what he seems to be saying is the following, that it is indeed possible to override your moral intuitions. Your moral intuitions themselves are not reliable on their own. Moral intuitions are given validation through divine commands, right? So your moral intuitions that you have on their own, they don't mean anything, right? But it's because of divine command theory and God's commands and God's mandates, and because of his character, it's why there's coherence between our moral intuitions and God's divine commands. Right? Now, God can indeed possibly command something against our moral intuitions because he's the writer of all. He's the legislator. And he can say something that is completely contrary to our moral intuitions. Again, there's no inconsistency so far. Right? So he can, in terms of a possibility, in theory, say something like murder that child over there. Right? But although it's possible that he might do that, no individual person is justified in believing that he has done that. Now, I don't think that there's an inconsistency there. He might be wrong.
I think no.
Let me just explain why.
Okay.
One minute.
Okay.
Before you finish, the reason it's not possible. Sorry, the reason somebody's not justified in believing in that is because, as what Craig said before, historically, the laying down of God's commands and divine codes was through biblical the narrative, the prophet, the miracles, the interventions, the way it was communicated to Joseph, and the things it was laid down through the various important people within Christianity. That's not happening to the random Joe down the street, and that I think that's what differentiates it. So it's more likely. So you could say I think what he's trying to say is like a probabilistic argument that it's more likely to be a hallucination or a dream or a case of mental illness today than it was back in the day, because the case for the resurrection, the case for the resurrection shows that you can't explain the resurrection through a delusion, hallucination, mental illness, and this was therefore divinely inspired words being given to the people then. Is that happening now to Bob down the corner street? No. And that's the distinction. So whilst it's possible that God can override what he did that 10 centuries ago, unless you have a similar revelation coming to Bob down the street, you're not justified in believing Bob's words. I think then.
No, I think I may have misheard. I think I may have misheard Madin, but I think
But I don't
when he
think the
said the
objection is
contradiction, the contradiction I thought, and I still think it is when he said that God cannot command this act because it is against his nature, right? The immoral act of killing someone, basically genocide or whatever, right? Killing your children. And I could have heard it wrong.
I think
And
he
that's what I'm
misspoke.
saying is because he has already done it.
Yeah.
There is no reason to believe that act God thinks is, and that's what the contradiction I'm seeing here.
Yeah, I heard something. All right, that point where he said initially, I know that kind of phrase that he said to Alex, that seems possibly against his nature, right?
Right. That's the point that I think is.
I think he might be saying something like, to us it looks like it's going to be against his nature, but again, if it's consistent with his, if it's the case ontologically, whatever God commands is going to be always consistent with his nature, then it's still possible. So I think he might be saying that meta-ethically it's right, but epistemically it might seem impossible that he can do something like that. So that's what he probably means, right? So meta-ethically, in terms of ontology, God commanding something like kill somebody is completely fine. It'll be consistent with his nature. But to us, it'll seem like it's possibly a contradiction. Now, maybe I'm being charitable here, but I think also he may have slipped up. He might kind of misspoke, right? He could have worded it better.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Okay. Let's give him benefit of the doubt over here. Probably because we are not certain. One thing, Madin, Kelly has left because it's family time right now. Shall we conclude this portion over here? Maybe we have few more minutes remaining. Maybe we can cover it later on. But we probably covered a large chunk of that.
I would just like to add one thing. That
Sure.
it is only now that we can suspend our judgment about whether it is a revelation or some psychological disorder. But what about someone like Prophet Muhammad? Because how can he could have judged that whether he was hallucinating or whether it was actually a divine command?
Right. I think
distinguish.
Christians will have to deal with all the other prophethood claims, right? That they reject, right?
Yes.
After Christianity, the same is true with Islam. Probably all the prophets that they don't consider,
Even if you believe that they were actually false prophets,
including Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, right?
you
So
still cannot morally
you have
critique
a
them.
you haven't solved any problem there. You just by saying this statement that Bill Craig said that we go by that standard. I don't think that makes sense because they reject all the other claims as well, pretty much, right? So yeah.
But and by the way, we don't usually need. I mean, we're just talking about this hallucinating things because Alex has raised it, right? And
right.
we're trying to figure out trying to make a comparable case with the Canaanites slaughter.
Exactly.
Yeah. But we don't need to go down that route really. We just can say that if all of the alleged prophethood claim arguments have been established, like let's say for Islam it might be the linguistic argument, scientific prophecies, not standard prophecies, and any other thing. It doesn't establish the moral nature of God, right? And anything that he claims about himself in the book. So that's all we have to say. And the same applies to Christianity as well. I think if you establish the resurrection, if you establish any other miracle, it doesn't establish the moral nature. I mean, you have the character of Jesus Christ, for example, but that's limiting the evidence to just what Jesus did in a small time period. Because if Jesus is making claims about God, then he has to look at the total evidence, and it's not just the minimum levels of nice gestures that he did during that time, healing or whatever, his charitable nature. We have to look at the rest of the world and the suffering that's been happening for 4.5 billion years or so, or 3.5 billion years, yeah? And in other words, he has to solve the problem of evil, but we can't assume his moral nature to solve the problem of evil, right? So it'd be circular. Because that's what's in question. So the problem of evil, the entirety of the suffering, of the level of suffering from the beginning of animals, basically, beginning of conscious creatures, is a case against establishing the moral, even right from the beginning, to establish the moral attributes of God, right? Because none of the arguments, whether they're prophethood claims, whether it's like the natural theological arguments, like design arguments, whether it's like philosophical, cosmological arguments, establish, apart from the ontological argument and maybe the moral argument, which tries to establish the moral nature of God. Apart from those two arguments, philosophical arguments, everything else doesn't establish, attempt to establish properly the attributes of moral properties of God. So we can never know that God is good. So how do we know that God is actually commanding us good commands? And that's all we have to say.
Right, exactly. All right, Madan, I think Kelly dropped out, and we should end the stream here. And let's carry on the further part of the review later on. Maybe I think we are done with it pretty much. Maybe we can just cover it a little bit in the next stream. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that'll be fine. I mean, yeah, that's all good. I mean, do we have any comments in our chat that you may want to look into?
I think we have
one.
quite a few. Let's see. All right, hi so far. Do you want to read them?
No, I mean, like any main comment that you might want to, any important one that we should address.
I think Bilal has commented. He's become a regular follower of our channel. Zipzap is again. There is this some Ugba guy. He's also a regular.
Yeah.
All right. I think I've seen Zipzap as well. Bilal has been a consistent commenter on the after the videos streams, even in the video clips as well. So yeah, thanks Bilal for watching us. Said Bhai, as always, is here with his little heart. All right, who else is there? Any good comment? Bilal has a few comments, good comments. I think we'll ask Bilal to join, and maybe if he wants to express something, if he's there today, maybe for a few minutes, then he's welcome to join. Cosmic said he can't join, and I asked him to join basically. All right, did you respond to that video, by the way, Ugba?
Yeah, our video is out now.
Okay,
It has been,
it's on Haris's channel. Which one? The
yes,
Haris Urdu?
yeah, Pakistani Malay.
All right. Okay, I need to watch that. Okay, that's any reaction on that? Okay, we'll talk about that later, right? Madan, this is for you.
Oh, I've not actually. I forgot about that. Was that sent to the Philosophy our email? I think it probably was, right?
Cosmic, do you have Madin's? I don't know. Did I send you that? I don't know. Okay,
I can't
maybe I
remember.
haven't. So if I haven't sent, then it's my bad.
Because I
Right.
asked Cosmic to share with me the email exchange. I'll be very very interested in seeing that. If Cosmic wants to send it to our, if he sent it already to our email box, then I'll check it out.
Or
If
I'll forward it to you both
yeah,
basically.
yeah.
If I haven't done it, then my apologies because I'm the culprit here.
Yeah,
Right?
because
Maybe I just forgot.
I don't think I've handed out my email, have I? I don't think. Yeah, I
You
don't
haven't
think I
handed
have.
out to anybody else. I mean,
Yeah.
it's right now it's among us only, right? So if you want to make it public,
No, no.
I would say
What
no.
I'll do?
I would say, yeah, I
No,
would
no.
say no.
Yeah,
I
the
would say
reason
no.
I yeah the reason I say that is I suspect I haven't said it, which means it must have gone to our brand email,
I mean, you
right?
can always give it to Cosmic. Of course, Cosmic is
I
within
know.
our group.
Yeah.
I mean, that's perfectly fine as much as, but not make it public. That's what I meant, right?
Sure,
So,
sure, sure,
yeah.
sure. I mean, I assume then he send it to our Philosapiens email, in which case it'll be there. So I'll check it
Right,
out
right.
first thing tomorrow, and
Okay,
I'll
okay.
yeah.
All right. Okay. All right. I don't think there are no more messages. Bilal has a few messages. So Bilal, yeah, he's chimed in with a few comments, right? Like you said, it's weird that God requires that you are philosophically educated to conclude if there's a God, and if you don't come to that conclusion, then you go to hell, right? Right. So if you say that God's definition of love is different from ours, then how can you say that the God? Yeah, I think, yeah, valid point, Bilal. All right, guys, I think it's pretty late. All of us are tired. I hope the stream was fruitful. We were able to challenge some of the arguments from or the reasoning behind why he supports Canaanite slaughter, and we gave arguments against it. Basically, it's you can consider it to be a problem of evil. He hasn't solved it. We gave answers, all of us, Mahadin mostly, as to why it is not. And all in all, I think it was a good stream. Madan, you want to add something before we do that? I think I would like to ask everybody and request rather everybody to like, subscribe, and share, and support us in whatever manner you guys can. If you think that we are doing it, and if you are able to do it, all the good. But nonetheless, share it, and after the stream is over or any new video is uploaded, do try to comment under those videos or streams that are concluded, so that our reach broadens to other audiences as well, pretty much, right? So press the notification bell so that you get the notification for. We have been a little inconsistent in doing streams and past probably 15-20 days, but we'll try to be more consistent, especially right now it's the month of Ramadan. So yeah, things probably don't fit in well with all of us. So, but yeah, Madan and Ugba, any closing statements?
No, I think we should just close it.
No,
Yeah,
no closing statements. I think we've done a good job on
yeah, I
this.
think pretty fair job. Yeah, pretty good job.
Yeah.
Thank you both,
Um,
Madan and Ugba. Yeah.
all right.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye for now.
Bye.